Chapter 16, Part 2 of A History of American Christianity by Leonard Woolsey Bacon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Chapter 16, Part 2, Conflicts of the Church with Public Wrongs. We have already recognized the Methodist organization as the effective pioneer of systematic abolitionism in America. The Baptists, also having their main strength in the Southern states, were early and emphatic in condemning the institutions by which they were surrounded. But all the sects found themselves embarrassed by serious difficulties when it came to the practical application of the principles and rules which they enunciated. The exacting of immediate emancipation as a condition of fellowship in the ministry or communion in the church, and the popular cries of no fellowship with slaveholders, and slaveholding always and everywhere a sin, were found practically to conflict with frequent, undeniable, and stubborn facts. The cases in which conscientious Christians found themselves, by no fault of their own, invested by inhuman laws with an absolute authority over helpless fellow-men, which it would not be right for them to suddenly abdicate, were neither few nor unimportant. In dealing with such cases, several different courses were open to the Church. 1. To execute discipline rigorously according to the formula, on the principle, be rid of the tares at all hazards, never mind the wheat. This course was naturally favored by some of the minor Presbyterian sects, and was apt to be vigorously urged by zealous people living at a distance and not well acquainted with the details of fact. 2. To attempt to provide for all cases by stated exceptions and saving clauses. This course was entered on by the Methodist Church, but without success. 3. Discouraged by the difficulties, to let go all discipline. This was the point reached at last by most of the Southern churches. 4. Clinging to the formulas, immediate emancipation, no communion with slaveholders, and so to palter in a double sense with the words as to evade the meaning of them. According to this method, slaveholding did not consist in the holding of slaves, but in holding them with evil purpose and wrong treatment. A slave who was held for his own advantage, receiving from his master that which is just and equal, was said, in this dialect, to be morally emancipated. This was the usual expedient of a large and respectable party of anti-slavery Christians at the North, when the principle of no communion with slaveholders brought them to the seeming necessity of excommunicating an unquestionably Christian brother for doing an undeniable duty. 5. To lay down broadly and explicitly the principles of Christian morality governing the subject, leaving the application of them in individual cases to the individual church or church member. This was the course exemplified with admirable wisdom and fidelity in the Presbyterian Deliverance of 1818. 6. To meet the postulate, laid down with so much assurance, as if an axiom, that slaveholding is always and everywhere a sin, to be immediately repented of and forsaken, with a flat and square contradiction, as being irreconcilable with facts and with the judgment of the Christian Scriptures, and thus to condemn and oppose to the utmost the system of slavery, without imputing the guilt of it to persons involved in it by no fault of their own. This, of course, commended itself to many lucid and logical minds and honest consciences, including some of the most consistent and effective opponents of slavery. Still another course must be mentioned, which, absurd as it seems, was actually pursued by a few headlong reformers, who showed in various ways a singular alacrity at playing into the hands of their adversaries. It consisted in enunciating in the most violent and untenable form and the most offensive language the proposition that all slaveholding is sin and every slaveholder a criminal, and making the whole attack on slavery to turn on this weak pivot and fail if this failed. The argument of this sort of abolitionist was, if there can be found anywhere a good man holding a bond servant unselfishly, kindly, and for good reason justifiably, then the system of American slavery is right. It is not strange that men in the Southern churches, being offered such an argument readily made to their hand, should promptly accept both the premise and the conclusion, and that so at last there should begin to be a pro-slavery party in the American church. This disastrous epoch of the beginning of what has been called the Southern apostasy from the universal moral sentiment of Christendom on the subject of slavery may be dated at about the year 1833. A year earlier began to be heard those vindications on political grounds of what had just been declared in the legislature of Virginia to be by common consent the most pernicious of political evils, vindications which continued for 30 years to invite the wonder of the civilized world. When, about 1833, a Presbyterian minister in Mississippi, the Reverend James Smiley, made the discovery, which surprised himself, that the system of American slavery was sanctioned and approved by the Scriptures as good and righteous, he found that his brethren in the Presbyterian ministry at the extreme South were not only surprised, but shocked and offended at the proposition. And yet such was the swift progress of this innovation that in surprisingly few years, we might almost say months, it had become not only prevalent, but violently and exclusively dominant in the Church of the Southern States, with the partial exception of Kentucky and Tennessee. It would be difficult to find a precedent in history for so sudden and sweeping a change of sentiment on a leading doctrine of moral theology. Dissent from the novel dogma was suppressed with more than inquisitorial rigor. It was less perilous to hold Protestant opinions in Spain or Austria than to hold, in Carolina or Alabama, the opinions which had but lately been commended to universal acceptance by the unanimous voice of great religious bodies, and proclaimed as undisputed principles by leading statesmen. It became one of the accepted evidences of Christianity at the South that infidelity failed to offer any justification for American slavery equal to that derived from the Christian Scriptures. That eminent leader among the Lutheran clergy, the Reverend Dr. Bachman of Charleston, referred that unexampled unanimity of sentiment that now exists in the whole South on the subject of slavery to be the confidence felt by the religious public in the Bible defense of slavery as set forth by clergymen and laymen in sermons and pamphlets and speeches in Congress. The historian may not excuse himself from the task of inquiring into the cause of this sudden and immense moral revolution. The explanation offered by Dr. Bachman is the very thing that needs to be explained. How came the Christian public throughout the slaveholding states, which so short a time before had been unanimous in finding in the Bible the condemnation of their slavery, to find all at once in the Bible the divine sanction and defense of it as a wise, righteous, and permanent institution? Doubtless there was a mixture of influences in bringing about the result. The immense advance on the market value of slaves consequent on Whitney's invention of the cotton gin had its unconscious effects on the moral judgments of some. The furious vituperations of a very small but noisy faction of anti-slavery men added something to the swift current of public opinion. But demonstrably the chief cause of this sudden change of religious opinion, one of the most remarkable in the history of the Church, was panic terror. In August 1831 a servile insurrection in Virginia, led by a crazy Negro, Nat Turner by name, was followed, as always in such cases, by bloody vengeance on the part of the whites. The Southampton insurrection, occurring at a time when the price of slaves was depressed in consequence of a depression in the price of cotton, gave occasion to a sudden development of opposition to slavery in the legislature of Virginia. A measure for the prospective abolition of the institution in that ancient commonwealth was proposed, earnestly debated, eloquently urged, and at last defeated, with a minority ominously large in its favor. Warned by so great a peril, and strengthened soon afterward by an increase in the market value of cotton and of slaves, the slaveholding interest in all the South was stimulated to new activity. Defenses of slavery more audacious than had been heard before began to be uttered by Southern politicians at home and by Southern representatives and senators in Congress. A panic seized upon the planters in some districts of the Southwest. Conspiracies and plans of insurrection were discovered. Negroes were tortured or terrified into confessions. Obnoxious white men were put to death without any legal trial in defiance of those rules of evidence which are insisted on by Southern laws. Thus a sudden and convincing terror was spread through the South. Every man was made to know that if he should become obnoxious to the guardians of the great Southern institution, he was liable to be denounced and murdered. It was distinctly and imperatively demanded that nobody should be allowed to say anything anywhere against slavery. The movement of the societies which had then been recently formed at Boston and New York, with immediate abolition for their motto, was made use of to stimulate the terror and the fury of the South. The position of political parties and of candidates for the presidency, just at that juncture, gave special advantage to the agitators, an advantage that was not neglected. Everything was done that practiced demagogues could contrive to stimulate the South into a frenzy and to put down at once and forever all opposition to slavery. The clergy and the religious bodies were summoned to the patriotic duty of committing themselves on the side of Southern institutions. Just then it was, if we mistake not, that their apostasy began. They dare not say that slavery as an institution in the state is essentially an organized injustice, and that, though the Scriptures rightly and wisely enjoin justice and the recognition of the slave's brotherhood upon masters, and conscientious meekness upon slaves, the organized injustice of the institution ought to be abolished by the shortest process consistent with public safety and the welfare of the enslaved. They dared not even keep silence under the plea that the institution is political and therefore not to be meddled with by religious bodies or religious persons. They yielded to the demand. They were carried along in the current of the popular frenzy. They joined in the clamor, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." They denounced the fanaticism of abolition, and permitted themselves to be understood as certifying, in the name of religion and of Christ, that the entire institution of slavery as it exists is chargeable with no injustice and is warranted by the word of God. There is no good reason to question the genuineness of sincerity of the fears expressed by the slave-holding population as a justification of their violent measures for the suppression of free speech in relation to slavery, nor of their belief that the papers and prints actively disseminated from the anti-slavery press in Boston were fitted, if not distinctly intended, to kindle bloody insurrections. These terrors were powerfully pleaded in the great debate in the Virginia legislature as an argument for the abolition of slavery. This failing, they became throughout the South a constraining power for the suppression of free speech, not only on the part of outsiders, but among the Southern people themselves. The regime thus introduced was in the strictest sense of the phrase a reign of terror. The universal lockjaw which thenceforth forbade the utterance of what had so recently and suddenly ceased to be the unanimous religious conviction of the Southern Church, soon produced an unexampled unanimity on the other side, broken only when some fiery and indomitable abolitionist, like Dr. Robert J. Breckinridge of the Presbyterian Church in Kentucky, delivered his soul with invectives against the system of slavery and the newfangled apologies that had been devised to defend it, declaring it utterly indefensible on every correct human principle, and utterly abhorrent from every law of God, and exclaiming, "Out upon such folly! The man who cannot see that involuntary domestic slavery, as it exists among us, is founded on the principle of taking by force that which is another's, has simply no moral sense. Hereditary slavery is without pretense except in avowed rapacity." Of course, the anti-slavery societies, which, under various names, had existed in the South by hundreds, were suddenly extinguished, and manumissions, which had been going on at the rate of thousands in a year, almost entirely ceased. The strange and swiftly spreading moral epidemic did not stop at state boundary lines. At the North, the main cause of defection was not indeed directly operative. There was no danger there of servile insurrection, but there was true sympathy for those who lived under the shadow of such impending horrors, threatening alike the guilty and the innocent. There was a deep passion of honest patriotism, now becoming alarmed lest the threats of disunion proceeding from the terrified South should prove a serious peril to the nation in whose prosperity the hopes of the world seemed to be involved. There was a worthy solicitude lest the bonds of intercourse between the churches of North and South should be ruptured, and so the integrity of the nation be the more imperiled. Withal there was a spreading and deepening and most reasonable disgust at the reckless ranting of a little knot of anti-slavery men having their headquarters at Boston, who, exulting in their irresponsibility, scattered loosely appeals to men's vindictive passions and filled the unwilling air with clamors against church and ministry and Bible and law and government, denounced as pro-slavery all who declined to accept their measures or their persons, and arrogating themselves exclusively the name abolitionist, made that name, so long a title of honor, to be universally odious. The various factors of public opinion were actively manipulated. Political parties competed for the Southern vote. Commercial houses competed for Southern business. Religious sects, parties, and societies were emulous in conciliating Southern adhesions or contributions and averting schisms. The condition of success in any one of these cases was well understood to be concession, or at least silence, on the subject of slavery. The pressure of motives, some of which were honorable and generous, was everywhere, like the pressure of the atmosphere. It was not strange that there should be defections from righteousness. Even the enormous effrontery of the slave power in demanding for its own security that the rule of tyrannous law and mob violence by which freedom of speech and of the press had been extinguished at the South should be extended over the so-called free states did not fail of finding citizens reputable standing so base as to give the demand their countenance, their public advocacy, and even their personal assistance. As the subject emerged from time to time in the religious community, the questions arising were often confused and embarrassed by false issues and illogical statements, and the state of opinion was continually misrepresented through the incurable habit of the overzealous in denouncing as pro-slavery those who dissented from their favorite formulas. But after all deductions, the historian who shall by and by review this period with the advantage of a longer perspective will be compelled to record not a few lamentable defections, both individual and corporate, from the cause of freedom, justice, and humanity. And nevertheless, that later record will also show that while the Southern Church had been terrified into an unexampled unanimity in renouncing the principles which it had unanimously held, and while like causes had wrought potentially upon Northern sentiment, it was the steadfast fidelity of the Christian people that saved the nation from ruin. At the end of 30 years from the time when the soil of Missouri was devoted to slavery, the Kansas-Nebraska bill was proposed, which should open for the extension of slavery the vast expanse of national territory which, by the stipulation of the Missouri Compromise, had been forever consecrated to freedom. The issue of the extension of slavery was presented to the people in its simplicity. The action of the clergy of New England was prompt, spontaneous, emphatic, and practically unanimous. Their memorial, with 3,050 signatures, protested against the bill, in the name of Almighty God and in his presence, as a great moral wrong, as a breach of faith eminently injurious to the moral principles of the community and subversive of all confidence in national engagements, as a measure full of danger to the peace and even the existence of our beloved Union, and exposing us to the just judgments of the Almighty. In like manner, the memorial of 151 clergymen of various denominations in New York City and the vicinity protested in like terms, in the name of religion and humanity, against the guilt of the extension of slavery. Perhaps there has been no occasion on which the consenting voice of the entire Church has been so solemnly uttered on a question of public morality, and this in the very region in which the Church and clergy had been most stormily denounced by the little handful of abolitionists who gloried in the name of the infidel, as a recreant to justice and humanity. The protest of the Church was of no avail to defeat the machination of the demagogues. The iniquitous measure was carried through. But this was not the end. It was only the beginning of the end. Yet 10 years, and American slavery, through the mad folly of its advocates and the steadfast fidelity of the great body of the earnestly religious people of the land, was swept away by the tide of war. The long struggle of the American Church against drunkenness as a social and public evil begins at an early date. One of the 13 colonies, Georgia, had the prohibition of slavery and of the importation of spirituous liquors incorporated by Oglethorpe in its early and short-lived constitution. It would be interesting to discover, if we could, to what extent the rigor of John Wesley's discipline against both these mischiefs was due to his association with Oglethorpe in the founding of that latest of the colonies. Both the imperious nature of Wesley and the peculiar nature of his fraternity as being originally not a church, but a voluntary society within the church, predisposed to a policy of arbitrary exclusiveness by hard and fast lines drawn according to formula, which might not have been ventured on by one who was consciously drawing up the conditions of communion in the church. In the Puritan colonies, the public morals in respect to temperance were from the beginning guarded by salutary license laws devised to suppress all dram shops and tippling houses, and to prevent, as far as law could wisely undertake to prevent, all abusive and mischievous sales of liquor. But these indications of a sound public sentiment did not prevent the dismal fact of a wide prevalence of drunkenness as one of the distinguishing characteristics of American society at the opening of the 19th century. Two circumstances had combined to aggravate the national vice. 7 years of army life, with its exhaustion and exposure and military social usage, had initiated into dangerous drinking habits many of the most justly influential leaders of society, and the example of these had set the tone for all ranks. Besides this, the increased importation and manufacture of distilled spirits had made it easy and common to substitute these for the mild fermented liquors which had been the ordinary drink of the people. Gradually and unobserved, the nation had settled down into a slough of drunkenness of which it is difficult for us at this date to form a clear conception. The words of Isaiah concerning the drunkards of Ephraim seemed not too strong to apply to the condition of American society, that all tables were full of vomit and filthiness. In the prevalence of intemperate drinking habits, the clergy had not escaped the general infection. The priest and the prophet had gone astray through strong drink. Individual words of warning, among the earliest of which was the classical essay of Dr. Benjamin Rush, 1785, failed to arouse general attention. The new century was well advanced before the stirring appeals of Ebenezer Porter, Lyman Beecher, Heman Humphrey, and Jeremiah Evarts had awakened in the church any effectual conviction of sin in the matter. The appointment of a strong committee in 1811 by the Presbyterian General Assembly was promptly followed by like action by the clergy of Massachusetts and Connecticut, leading to the formation of state societies. But general concerted measures on a scale commensurate with the evil to be overcome must be dated from the organization of the American Society for the Promotion of Temperance in 1826. The first aim of the reformers of that day was to break down those domineering social usages which almost enforce the habit of drinking in ordinary social intercourse. The achievement of this object was wonderfully swift and complete. A young minister, whose pastorate had begun at about the same time with the organization of the National Temperance Society, was able at the end of 5 years to bear this testimony in the presence of those who were in a position to recognize any misstatement or exaggeration. The wonderful change which the past 5 years have witnessed in the manners and habits of this people in regard to the use of ardent spirits, the new phenomenon of an intelligent people rising up, as it were, with one consent, without law, without any attempt at legislation, to put down by the mere force of public opinion, expressing itself in voluntary associations, a great social evil which no despot on earth could have put down among his subjects by any system of efforts, has excited admiration and roused to imitation not only in our sister country of Great Britain, but in the heart of continental Europe. It is worthy of remark, for any possible instruction there may be in it, that the first, greatest, and most permanent of the victories of the temperance reformation, the breaking down of almost universal social drinking usages, was accomplished while yet the work was a distinctively religious one, without law or attempt at legislation, and while the efforts at suppression were directed at the use of ardent spirits. The attempt to combine the friends of temperance on a basis of teetotal abstinence, putting fermented as well as distilled liquors under the ban, dates from as late as 1836. But it soon appeared that the immense gain of banishing ardent spirits from the family table and sideboard, the social entertainment, the haying field, and the factory had not been attained without some corresponding loss. Close upon the heels of the reform in the domestic and social habits of the people, there was spawned a monstrous brood of obscure tippling shops, a nuisance, at least in New England, till then unknown. From the beginning wise and effective license laws had interdicted all dram shops. Even the taverner might sell spirits only to his transient guests, not to people of the town. With the suppression of social drinking, there was effected, in spite of salutary law to the contrary, a woeful change. The American saloon was, in an important sense, the offspring of the American temperance reformation. The fact justified the reformer in turning his attention to the law. From that time onward, the history of the temperance reformation has included the history of multitudinous experiments in legislation, none of which has been so conclusive as to satisfy all students of the subject that any later law is, on the whole, more usefully effective than the original statutes of the Puritan colonies. In 1840, the temperance reformation received a sudden forward impulse from an unexpected source. One evening, a group of 6 notoriously hard drinkers, coming together greatly impressed from a sermon of that noted evangelist Elder Jacob Knapp, pledged themselves by mutual vows to total abstinence, and from this beginning went forward that extraordinary agitation known as the Washingtonian movement. Up to this time, the aim of the reformers had been mainly directed to the prevention of drunkenness by a change in social customs and personal habits. Now there was suddenly opened a door of hope to the almost despair of the drunkard himself. The lately reformed drunkards of Baltimore set themselves to the reforming of other drunkards, and these took up the work in their turn, and the Reformation was extended in a geometrical progression till it covered the country. Everywhere meetings were held, to be addressed by reformed drunkards, and new recruits from the gutter were pushed forward to tell their experience to the admiring public and set out on speaking tours. The people were stirred up as never before on the subject of temperance. There was something very Christian-like in the method of this propagation, and hopeful souls looked forward to a temperance millennium as at hand. But fatal faults in the work soon discovered themselves. Among the new evangelists were not a few men of true penitence and humility, like John Hawkins, and one man at least of incomparable eloquence as well as Christ earnestness, John B. Gough. But the public were not long in finding that merely to have wallowed in vice and to be able to tell ludicrous or pathetic stories from one's experience was not of itself sufficient qualification for the work of a public instructor in morals. The temperance platform became infested with swaggering autobiographers, whose glory was in their shame, and whose general influence was distinctly demoralizing. The sudden influx of the tide of enthusiasm was followed by a disastrous ebb. It was the estimate of Mr. Gough that out of 600,000 reformed drunkards, not less than 450,000 had relapsed into vice. The same observer, the splendor of whose eloquence was well mated with an unusual sobriety of judgment, is credited with the statement that he knew of no case of stable reformation from drunkenness that was not connected with a thorough spiritual renovation and conversion. Certainly good was accomplished by the transient whirlwind of the Washingtonian excitement, but the evil that it did lived after it. Already at the time of its breaking forth, the temperance reformation had entered upon that period of decadence in which its main interest was to be concentrated upon law and politics. And here the vicious ethics of the reformed drunkard school became manifest. The drunkard, according to his own account of himself, unless he was not only reformed but repentant, had been a victim of circumstances. Drunkenness, instead of a base and beastly sin, was an infirmity incident to a high-strung and generous temperament. The blame of it was to be laid, not upon the drunkard, whose exquisitely susceptible organization was quite unable to resist temptation coming in his way, but on those who put intoxicating liquor where he could get at it, or on the state, whose duty it was to put the article out of reach of its citizens. The guilt of drunkenness must rest, not on the unfortunate drunkard who happened to be attacked by that disease, but on the sober and well-behaving citizen, and especially the Christian citizen, who did not vote the correct ticket. What may be called the Prohibition period of the Temperance Reformation begins about 1850 and still continues. It is characterized by the pursuit of a type of legislation of variable efficacy or inefficacy, the essence of which is that the sale of intoxicating liquors shall be a monopoly of the government. Indications began to appear that the disproportionate devotion of measures of legislation and politics is abating. Some of the most effective recent labor for the promotion of temperance has been wrought independently of such resort. If the cycle shall be completed and the Church come back to the methods by which its first triumphs in this field were won, it will come back the wiser and the stronger for its vicissitudes of experience through these 60 years and 10. End of chapter 16, part 2. Chapter 17, Part 1 of A History of American Christianity by Leonard Woolsey Bacon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Chapter 17, Part 1, A Decade of Controversies and Schisms. During the period from 1835 to 1845, the spirit of schism seemed to be in the air. In this period no one of the larger organizations of churches was free from agitating controversies, and some of the most important of them were rent asunder by explosion. At the time when the Presbyterian Church suffered its great schism in 1837, it was the most influential religious body in the United States. In 120 years its solitary presbytery had grown into 135 presbyteries, including 2,140 ministers, serving 2,865 churches and 220,557 communicants. But these large figures are an inadequate measure of its influence. It represented in its ministry and membership the two most masterful races on the continent, the New England colonists and the Scotch-Irish immigrants. And the tenacity with which it had adhered to the tradition derived through both these lines, of admitting none but liberally educated men to its ministry, had given it exceptional social standing and control over men of intellectual strength and leadership. In the 4 years beginning with 1831, the additions to its roll of communicants on examination had numbered nearly 100,000. But this spiritual growth was chilled and stunted by the dissensions that arose. The revivals ceased, and the membership actually dwindled. The contention had grown, a fact not without parallel in church history, out of measures devised in the interest of cooperation and union. In 1801, in the days of its comparative feebleness, the General Assembly had proposed to the General Association of Connecticut a plan of union, according to which the communities of New England Christians then beginning to move westward between the parallels that bound the New England zone, and bringing with them their accustomed congregational polity, might cooperate on terms of mutual concession with Presbyterian churches in their neighborhood. The proposals had been fraternally received and accepted, and under the terms of this compact great accessions had been made to the strength of the Presbyterian Church, of pastors and congregations marked with the intellectual activity and religious enterprise of the New England churches, who, while cordially conforming to the new methods of organization and discipline, were not in the least penetrated with the traditionary Scotch veneration for the Westminster standards. For nearly 30 years the great reinforcements from New England and from men of the New England way of thinking had been ungrudgingly bestowed and heartily welcomed. But the great accessions which in the first 4 years of the fourth decade of this century had increased the roll of the communicants of the Presbyterian Church by more than 50%, had come in undue proportion from the New Englandized regions of western New York and Ohio. It was inevitable that the jealousy of hereditary Presbyterians, whose were the fathers, should be aroused by the perfectly reasonable fear lest the traditional ways of the church which they felt to be in a peculiar sense their church might be affected by so large an element from without. The grounds of explicit complaint against the party called New School were principally twofold, doctrine and organization. In the Presbyterian Church at this time were three pretty distinct types of theological thought. First, there was the unmitigated Scotch Calvinism. Secondly, there was the modification of this system, which became naturalized in the church after the Great Awakening, when Jonathan Dickinson and Jonathan Edwards, from neighbor towns in Massachusetts, came to be looked upon as the great Presbyterian theologians. Thirdly, there was the consistent Calvinism that had been still further evolved by the patient labor of students in direct succession from Edwards, and that was known under the name of Hopkinsonianism. Just now, the latest and not the least eminent in this school, Dr. Nathaniel W. Taylor of New Haven, was enunciating to large and enthusiastic classes in Yale Divinity School new definitions and forms of statement giving rise to much earnest debate. The alarm of those to whom the very phrase "improvement in theology" was an abomination expressed itself in futile indictments for heresy brought against some of the most eminently godly and useful ministers in all the church. Lyman Beecher of Lane Seminary, Edward Beecher, J.M. Sturtevant, and William Kirby of Illinois College, and George Duffield of the Presbytery of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, were annoyed by impeachments for heresy, which all failed before reaching the court of last resort. But repeated and persistent prosecutions of Albert Barnes of Philadelphia were destined to more conspicuous failure, by reason of their coming up year after year before the General Assembly, and also by reason of the position of the accused as pastor of the mother church of the denomination, the First Church of Philadelphia, which was the customary meeting place of the assembly; withal by reason of the character of the accused, the honor and love in which he was held for his faithful and useful work as pastor, his world-wide fame as a devoted and believing student of the Scriptures, and the Christ-like gentleness and meekness with which he endured the harassing of church trials continuing through a period of 7 years, and compelling him, under an irregular and illegal sense of the synod, to sit silent in his church for the space of a year, as one suspended from the ministry. The earliest leaders in national organization for the propagation of Christianity at home and abroad were the Congregationalists of New England and men like-minded with them. But the societies thus originated were organized on broad and Catholic principles, and invited the coöperation of all Christians. They naturally became the organs of much of the active beneficence of Presbyterian congregations, and the Presbyterian clergy and laity were largely represented in the direction of them. They were recognized and commended by the representative bodies of the Presbyterian Church. As a point of High Church theory, it was held by the rigidly Presbyterian party that the work of the gospel in all its departments and in all lands is the proper function of the church as such, meaning practically that each sect ought to have its separate propaganda. There was logical strength in this position as reached from their premises, and there were arguments of practical convenience to be urged in favor of it. But the demand to sunder at once the bonds of fellowship which united Christians of different names to the beneficent work of the great national societies was not acceptable even to the whole of the Old School party. To the New Englanders it was intolerable. There were other and less important grounds of difference that were discussed between the parties, and in the background, behind them all, was the slavery question. It seems to have been willingly kept in the background by the leaders of debate on both sides, but it was there. The New School synods and presbyteries of the North were firm in their adherence to the anti-slavery principles of the Church. On the other hand, the Old School party relied, in the coup d'éclat that was in preparation, on the support of an almost solid South. It was an unpardonable offense of the New School party that it had grown to such formidable strength, intellectually, spiritually, and numerically. The probability that the church might, with the continued growth and influence of this party, become Americanized and so lose the purity of its thoroughgoing Scotch traditions was very real, and to some minds very dreadful. To these the very ark of God seemed in danger. Arraignments for heresy in presbytery and synod resulted in failure, and when these and other cases involving questions of orthodoxy or of the policy of the church were brought into the supreme judicature of the church, the solemn but unmistakable fact disclosed itself that even the General Assembly could not be relied on for the support of measures introduced by the Old School leaders. In fact, every assembly from 1831 to 1836, with a single exception, had shown a clear New School majority. The foundations were destroyed, and what should the righteous do? History was about to repeat itself with unwonted preciseness of detail. On the gathering of the Assembly of 1837, a careful count of noses revealed what had been known only once before in 7 years, and what might never be again, a clear Old School majority in the House. To the pious mind, the neglecting of such an opportunity would have been to tempt Providence. Without notice, without complaint or charges or specifications, without opportunity of defense, 4 synods, including 533 churches and more than 100,000 communicants, were excommunicated by a majority vote. The victory of pure doctrine and strict church order, though perhaps not exactly glorious, was triumphant and irreversible. There was no more danger to the church from a possible New School majority. When the 4 exscinded synods, 3 in western New York and 1 in Ohio, together with a great following of sympathizing congregations in all parts of the country, came together to reconstruct their shattered polity. They were found to number about 4/9 of the late Presbyterian Church. For 30 years the American Church was to present to Christendom the strange spectacle of two great ecclesiastical bodies claiming identically the same name, holding the same doctrinal standards, observing the same ritual and governed by the same discipline, and occupying the same great territory, and yet completely dissevered from each other and at times in relations of sharp mutual antagonism. The unlikeliest place in all American Christendom for a partisan controversy and a schism would have seemed to have been the Unitarian denomination in and about Boston. Beginning with the refusal not only of any imposed standard of belief, but of any statement of common opinions, and with unlimited freedom of opinion in every direction, unless perhaps in the direction of orthodoxy, it was not easy to see how a splitting wedge could be started in it. But the infection of the time was not to be resisted. Even Unitarianism must have its heresies and heresiarchs to deal with. No sooner did pressure of outside attack abate than antagonisms began pretty sharply to declare themselves. In 1832 Mr. Ralph Waldo Emerson, pastor of the Second Church in Boston, proposed to the church to abandon or radically change the observance of the Lord's Supper. When the church demurred at this extraordinary demand he resigned his office, firing off an elaborate argument against the usage of the church by way of a parting salute. Without any formal demission of the ministry he retired to his literary seclusion at Concord, from which he brought forth in books and lectures the oracular utterances which caught more and more the ear of a wide public, and in which, in casual seeming parentheses and obiter dicta, Christianity and all practical religion were condemned by sly innuendo and half respectful allusion by which he might, without sneering, teach the rest to sneer. In 1838 he was still so far recognized in the ministry as to be invited to address the graduating class of the Harvard Divinity School. The blank pantheism which he then enunciated called forth from Professor Henry Ware, Jr., a sermon in the college chapel on the personality of God, which he sent with a friendly note to Mr. Emerson. The gay and skimpolesque reply of the sage is an illustration of that flippancy with which he chose to toy in a literary way with momentous questions, and which was so exasperating to the earnest men of positive religious convictions with whom he had been associated in the Christian ministry. It strikes me very oddly that good and wise men at Cambridge should think of raising me into an object of criticism. I have always been, from my incapacity of methodical writing, a chartered libertine, free to worship and free to rail, lucky when I could make myself understood, but never esteemed near enough to the institutions and mind of society to deserve the notice of masters of literature and religion. I could not possibly give you one of the arguments you so cruelly hit at on which any doctrine of mine stands, for I do not know what arguments mean in reference to any expression of thought. I delight in telling what I think, but if you ask me how I dare say so, or why it is so, I am the most helpless of mortal men. I do not even see that either of these questions admits of an answer. So that in the present droll posture of my affairs, when I see myself suddenly raised into importance of a heretic, I am very uneasy when I advert to the supposed duties of such a personage who is to make good his thesis against all comers. I certainly shall do no such thing. The issue was joined and the controversy began. Professor Andrews Norton, in a pamphlet, denounced the latest form of infidelity, and the Rev. George Ripley replied in a volume, to which Professor Norton issued a rejoinder. But there was not substance enough of religious dogma and sentiment in the transcendentalist philosophers to give them any permanent standing in the Church. They went into various walks of secular literature and have powerfully influenced the course of opinions, but they came to be no longer recognizable as a religious or theological party. Among the minor combatants in the conflict between the Unitarians and the Pantheists was a young man whose name was destined to become conspicuous, not within the Unitarian fellowship, but on the outskirts of it. Theodore Parker was a man of a different type from the men about him of either party. The son of a mechanic, he fought his way through difficulties to a liberal education, and was 30 years old before his very great abilities attracted general attention. A greedy gormandizer of books in many languages, he had little of the dainty scholarship so much prized at the neighboring university. But the results of his vast reading were stored in a quick and tenacious memory as ready rhetorical material wherewith to convince or astonish. Paradox was a passion with him, that was stimulated by complaints, and even by deprecations, to the point of irreverence. He liked to make people's flesh crawl. Even in his advocacy of social and public reforms, which was strenuous and sincere, he delighted so to urge his cause as to inflame prejudice and opposition against it. With this temper, it is not strange that when he came to enunciate his departure from some of the accepted tenets of his brethren, who were habitually reverent in their discipleship towards Jesus Christ, he should do this in a way to offend and shock. The immediate reaction of the Unitarian clergy from the statements of his sermon, in 1841, on the transient and the permanent in Christianity, in which the supernatural was boldly discarded from his belief, was so general and so earnest as to give occasion to Channing's exclamation, "Now we have a Unitarian orthodoxy." Channing did not live to see the characteristic tenets of the heresiarch to whom he hesitated to give the name of Christian not only widely accepted in the Unitarian churches, but some of them freely discussed as open questions among some orthodox scholars. Two very great events in this period of schism may be dispatched with a brevity out of all proportion to their importance, on account of the simplicity of motive and action by which they are characterized. In the year 1844, the slavery agitation in the Methodist Episcopal Church culminated, not in the rupture of the church, but in the well-considered deliberate division of it between North and South. The history of the slavery question among the Methodists was a typical one. From the beginning, the Methodist Society had been committed by its founder and his early successors to the strictest, not the strongest, position on this question. Not only was the system of slavery denounced as iniquitous, but the attempt was made to enforce the rigid rule that persons involved under this system in the relation of master to slave should be excluded from the ministry, if not from the communion. But the enforcement of this rule was found to be not only difficult, but wrong, and difficult simply because it was wrong. Then followed that illogical confusion of ideas studiously fostered by zealots at either extreme. If the slaveholder may be in some circumstances a faithful Christian disciple, fulfilling in righteousness and love a Christian duty, then slavery is right. If slavery is wrong, then every slaveholder is a man-stealer and should be excommunicated as such without asking any further questions. Two statements more palpably illogical were never put forth for the darkening of counsel. But each extreme was eager to sustain the unreason of the opposite extreme as the only alternative of its own unreason, and so, what with contrary gusts from north and south, they fell into a place where two seas met and ran the ship aground. The attempts made from 1836 to 1840, by stretching to the utmost the authority of the General Conference and the bishops, for the suppression of modern abolitionism in the Church, without saying what they meant by the phrase, had their natural effect. The anti-slavery sentiment in the Church organized and uttered itself more vigorously and more extravagantly than ever on the basis, "All slaveholding is sin, no fellowship with slaveholders." In 1843 an anti-slavery secession took place which drew after it a following of 6,000, increased in a few months to 15,000. The paradoxical result of this movement is not without many parallels in church history. After the drawing off of 15,000 of the most zealous anti-slavery men in the church, the anti-slavery party in the church was vastly stronger, even in numbers, than it had been before. The General Conference of 1836 had pronounced itself, without a dissenting vote, to be decidedly opposed to modern abolitionism. The General Conference of 1844, on the first test vote on the question of excluding from the ministry one who had become a slaveholder through marriage, revealed a majority of 117 to 56 in favor of the most rigorous anti-slavery discipline. The graver question upon the case of Bishop Andrew, who was in the like condemnation, could not be decided otherwise. The form of the conference's action in this case was studiously inoffensive. It imputed no wrong and proposed no censure, but simply, on the ground that the circumstances would embarrass him in the exercise of his office, declared it as the sense of this General Conference that he desist from the exercise of this office so long as this impediment remains. The issue could not have been simpler and clearer. The conference was warned that the passage of the resolution would be followed by the secession of the South. The debate was long, earnest, and tender. At the end of it, the resolution was passed 111 to 69. At once notice was given of the intended secession. Commissioners were appointed from both parties to adjust the conditions of it, and in the next year, 1845, was organized the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Under the fierce tyranny then dominant at the South, the Southern Baptists might not fall behind their Methodist neighbors in zeal for slavery. This time it was the South that forced the issue. The Alabama Baptist Convention, without waiting for a concrete case, demanded of the national missionary boards the distinct, explicit avowal that slaveholders are eligible and entitled equally with non-slaveholders to all the privileges and immunities of their several unions. The answer of the Foreign Missions Board was perfectly kind, but, on the main point, perfectly unequivocal. We can never be party to any arrangement which would imply approbation of slavery. The result had been foreseen. The great denomination was divided between North and South. The Southern Baptist Convention was organized in May, 1845, and began its home and foreign missionary work without delay. This dark chapter of our story is not without its brighter aspects. 1. Amid the inevitable asperities attendant on such debate and division, there were many and beautiful manifestations of brotherly love between the separated parties. 2. These strifes fell out to the furtherance of the gospel. Emulations, indeed, are not among the works of the Spirit. In the strenuous labors of the two divided denominations, greatly exceeding what had gone before, it is plain that sometimes Christ was preached of envy and strife. Nevertheless, Christ was preached, with great and salutary results, and therein do we rejoice, yea, and will rejoice. End of chapter 17, part 1. Chapter 17, Part 2 of A History of American Christianity by Leonard Woolsey Bacon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by K. Hand. Chapter 17, Part 2, A Decade of Controversies and Schisms. Two important orders in the American Church, which for a time had almost faded out from our field of vision, come back, from about this epoch of debate and division, into continually growing conspicuousness and strength. Neither of them was implicated in that great debate involving the fundamental principles of the kingdom of heaven, the principles of righteousness and love to men, by which other parts of the church had been agitated and sometimes divided. Whether to their discredit or to their honor, it is part of history that neither the Protestant Episcopal Church nor the Roman Catholic Church took any important part, either corporately or through its representative men, in the agonizing struggle of the American Church to maintain justice and humanity in public law and policy. But standing thus aloof from the great ethical questions that agitated the conscience of the nation, they were both of them disturbed by controversies, internal or external, which demand mention at least in this chapter. The beginning of the resuscitation of the Protestant Episcopal Church from the dead and alive condition in which it had so long been languishing is dated from the year 1811. This year was marked by the accession to the episcopate of two eminent men representing two strongly divergent parties in that church. Bishop Griswold of Massachusetts, evangelical, and Bishop Hobart of New York, high churchman. A quorum of 3 bishops having been gotten together, not without great difficulty, the two were consecrated in Trinity Church, New York, May 29, 1811. The time was opportune, and the conjuncture of circumstances singularly favorable. The stigma of Toryism, which had marked the Church from long before the War of Independence, was now more than erased. In New England, the Episcopal Church was of necessity committed to that political party which favored the abolition of the privileges of the standing order, and this was the anti-English party, which under the lead of Jefferson was fast forcing the country into war with England. The Episcopalians were now in a position to retort the change of disloyalty under which they had not unjustly suffered. At the same time, the Church lost nothing of the social prestige incidental to its relation to the established Church of England. Politicians of the Democratic party, including some men of well-deserved credit and influence, naturally attached themselves to a religious party having many points of congeniality. In another sense also, the time was opportune for an advance of the Episcopal Church. In the person of Bishop Hobart, it had now a bold, energetic, and able representative of principles hitherto not much in favor in America, the thoroughgoing high church principles of Archbishop Laud. Before this time the Episcopal Church had had very little to contribute by way of enriching the diversity of the American sects. It was simply the feeblest of the communions bearing the common family traits of the Great Awakening, with the not important differentia of its settled ritual of worship and its traditions of order and decorum. But when Bishop Hobart put the trumpet to his lips and prepared himself to sound, the public heard a very different note, and no uncertain one. The Church, meaning his own fragment of the Church, the one channel of saving grace, the vehicles of that grace, the sacraments, valid only when ministered by a priesthood with the right pedigree of ordination, submission to the constituted authorities of the Church absolutely unlimited, except by clear divine requirements, abstinence from prayer meetings, firm opposition to revivals of religion, refusal of all cooperation with Christians outside of his own sect in endeavors for the general advancement of religion, such were some of the principles and duties inculcated by this bishop of the new era as of binding force. The courage of this attitude was splendid and captivating. It requires, even at the present time, not a little force of conviction to sustain one in publicly enunciating such views, but at the time of the accession of Hobart, when the Episcopal Church was just beginning to lift up its head out of the dust of despair, it needed the heroism of a martyr. It was not only the vast multitude of American Christians outside of the Episcopal Church, comprising almost all the learning, the evangelistic zeal, and the charitable activity and self-denial of the American Church of that time that heard these unwonted pretensions with indignation or with ridicule. In the Episcopal Church itself they were disclaimed, scouted, and denounced with, if possible, greater indignation still. But the new party had elements of growth for which its adversaries did not sufficiently reckon. The experience of other orders in the Church confirms this principle, that steady persistence and iteration in assuring any body of believers that they are in some special sense the favorites of heaven, and in assuring any body of clergy that they are endued from on high with some special and exceptional powers, will by and by make an impression on the mind. The flattering assurance may be coyly waved aside. It may even be indignantly repelled, but in the long run there will be a growing number of the brethren who become convinced that there is something in it. It was in harmony with human nature that the party of high pretensions to distinguished privileges for the Church and the prerogatives for the priesthood should in a few years become a formidable contestant for the control of the denomination. The controversy between the two parties rose to its height of exacerbation during the prevalence of that strange epidemic of controversy which ran simultaneously through so many of the great religious organizations of the country at once. No denomination had it in a more malignant form than the Episcopalians. The war of pamphlets and newspapers was fiercely waged, and the election of bishops sometimes became a bitter party contest, with the unpleasant incidents of such competitions. In the midst of the controversy at home, the publication of the Oxford Tracts added new asperity to it. A distressing episode of the controversy was the arraignment of no less than 4 of the 20 bishops on charges affecting their personal character. In the morbid condition of the body ecclesiastic, every such hurt festered. The highest febrile temperature was reached when, at an ordination in 1843, 2 of the leading presbyters in the diocese of New York rose in their places, and, reading each one his solemn protest against the ordaining of one of the candidates on the ground of his Romanizing opinions, left the church. The result of the long conflict was not immediately apparent. It was not only that high opinions, even the highest of the Tractarian school, were to be tolerated within the church, but that the High Church party was to be the dominant party. The Episcopal Church was to stand before the public as representing, not that which it held in common with the other churches of the country, but that which was most distinctive. From this time forth the evangelical party continued relatively to decline, down to the time, 30 years later, when it was represented in the inconsiderable succession of the Reformed Episcopal Church. The combination of circumstances and influences by which this party supremacy was brought about is an interesting study, for which, however, there is no room in this brief compendium of history. A more important fact is this, that in spite of these agitating internal strifes, and even by reason of them, the growth of the denomination was wonderfully rapid and strong. No fact in the external history of the American Church at this period is more imposing than this growth of the Episcopal Church from nothing to a really commanding stature. It is easy to enumerate minor influences tending to this result, some of which are not of high spiritual dignity, but these must not be overestimated. The nature of this growth, as well as the numerical amount of it, requires to be considered. The strongly distinguished order in the American Church has been aggrandized, not, to any great degree, by immigration, nor by conquest from the ranks of the irreligious, but by a continual stream of accessions both to its laity and to its clergy from other sects of the Church. These accessions have of course been variable in quality, but they have included many such as no denomination could afford to lose, and such as any would be proud to receive. Without judging of individual cases, it is natural and reasonable to explain so considerable a current setting so steadily for 2 generations toward the Episcopal Church as being attracted by the distinctive characteristics of that Church. Foremost among these we may reckon the study of the dignity and beauty of public worship, and the tradition and use of forms of devotion of singular excellence and value. A tendency to revert to the ancient Calvinist doctrine of the sacraments has prepossessed some in favor of the sect in which the old Calvinism is still cherished. Some have rejoiced to find a door of access to the communion of the Church not beset with revivalist exactions of examination and scrutiny of the sacred interior experiences of the soul. Some have reacted from an excessive or inquisitive or arbitrary church discipline toward a default of discipline. Some, worthily weary of sectarian division and of the evangelical doctrine that schism is the normal condition of the Church of Christ, have found real comfort in taking refuge in a sect in which, closing their eyes, they can say, "There are no schisms in the Church is one and undivided, and we are it." These and other like considerations, mingled in varying proportions, have been honorable motives impelling toward the Episcopal denomination, and few that have felt the force of them have felt constrained stubbornly to resist the gentle assurances offered by the apostolic succession theory of a superior authority and prerogative with which they had become invested. The numerous accessions to the Episcopal Church from other communions have, of course, been in large part reinforcements to the already dominant party. In the Roman Catholic Church of the United States during this stormy period there was by no means a perfect calm. The ineradicable feeling of the American citizen, however recent his naturalization, that he has a right to do what he will with his own, had kept asserting itself in that plausible but untenable claim of the laity to manage the church property acquired by their own contributions, which is known to Catholic writers as trusteeism. Through the whole breadth of the country, from Buffalo to New Orleans, sharp conflicts over this question between clergy and laity had continued to vex the peace of the church, and the victory of the clergy had not been unvarying and complete. When, in 1837, Bishop John Hughes took over the reins of spiritual power in New York, he resolved to try conclusions with the trustees who attempted to overrule his authority in his own cathedral. Sharply threatening to put the church under interdict if necessary, he brought the recalcitrants to terms at last by a less formidable process. He appealed to the congregation to withhold all further contributions from the trustees. The appeal for conscience's sake to refrain from giving has always a double hope of success, and the bishop succeeded in ousting the trustees at the serious risk of teaching the people a trick which has since been found equally effective when applied on the opposite side of a dispute between clergyman and congregation. In Philadelphia the long struggle was not ended without the actual interdicting of the Cathedral of St. Mary's, April, 1831. In Buffalo, so late as 1847, even this extreme measure, applied to the largest congregation in the newly erected diocese, did not at once enforce submission. The conflict with trusteeism was only one out of many conflicts which gave abundant exercise to the administrative abilities of the American bishops. The mutual jealousies of the various nationalities and races among the laity, and of the various sects of the regular clergy, menaced, and have not so wholly ceased to menace, the harmony of the Church, if not its unity. One disturbing element by which the Roman Catholic Church in some European countries has been sorely vexed makes no considerable figure in the corresponding history in America. There has never been here any liberal Catholic party. The fact stands in analogy with many like facts. Visitors to America from the established churches of England or Scotland or Germany have often been surprised to find the temper of the old country church so much broader and less rigid than that of the daughter church in the new and free republic. The reason is less recondite than may be supposed. In the old countries there are retained in connection with the state church, by constraint of law or of powerful social or family influences, many whose adhesion to its distinctive tenets and rules is slight and superficial. It is out of such material that the liberal church party grows. In the migration it is not that the liberal churchman becomes more strict, but that, being released from outside pressure, he becomes less of a churchman. He easily draws off from his hereditary communion and joins himself to some other, or to none at all. This process of evaporation leaves behind it a strong residuum in which all characteristic elements are held as in a saturated solution. A further security of the American Catholic Church against the growth of any liberal Catholic party like those of continental Europe is the absolutist organization of the hierarchy under the personal government of the Pope. In these last few centuries great progress has been made by the Roman See in extinguishing the ancient traditions of local or national independence in the election of bishops. Nevertheless, in Catholic Europe important relics of this independence give an effective check to the absolute power of Rome. In America no trace of this historic independence has ever existed. The power of appointing and removing bishops is held absolutely and exclusively by the Pope, and exercised through the Congregation of the Propaganda. The power of ordaining and assigning priests is held by the bishop, who also holds or controls the title to the church property in his diocese. The security against partisan divisions within the church is as complete as it can be made without gravely increasing the risks of alienating additional multitudes from the fellowship of the church. During the whole of this dreary decade there were fightings without as well as within for the Catholic Church in the United States. Its great and sudden growth, solely by immigration, had made it distinctively a church of foreigners, and chiefly of Irishmen. The conditions were favorable for the development of a race prejudice aggravated by a religious antipathy. It was a good time for the impostor, the fanatic, and the demagogue to get in their work. In Boston in 1834 the report that a woman was detained against her will in the Ursuline convent at Charlestown near Boston led to the burning of the building by a drunken mob. The Titus Oates of the American no popery panic in 1836 was an infamous woman named Maria Monk, whose monstrous stories of secret horrors perpetuated in a convent in Montreal, in which she claimed to have lived as a nun, were published by a respectable house and had immense currency. A New York pastor of good standing, Dr. Brownlee, made himself sponsor for her character and her stories, and when these had been thoroughly exposed, by Protestant ministers and laymen, for the shameless frauds that they were, there were plenty of zealots to sustain her still. A Protestant society was organized in New York and solicited the contributions of the benevolent and pious to promote the dissemination of raw head and bloody bones literature on the horrors of popery. The enterprise met with reprobation from sober-minded Protestants, but it was not without its influence for mischief. The presence of a great foreign vote, easily manipulated and cast in block, was proving a copious source of political corruption. Large concessions of privilege or of public property to Catholic institutions were reasonably suspected to have been made in consideration of clerical services in partisan politics. The conditions provoked, we might say, necessitated, a political reform movement which took the name and character of Native American. In Philadelphia, a city notorious at that time for misgovernment and turbulence, an orderly American meeting was attacked and broken up by an Irish mob. One act of violence led to another, the excitement increasing from day to day. Deadly shots were exchanged in the streets, houses from which balls had been fired into the crowd were set in flames, which spread to the other houses, churches were burned, and the whole city dominated by mobs that were finally suppressed by the state militia. It was an appropriate climax to the 10 years of ecclesiastical and social turmoil. End of chapter 17, part 2. Chapter 18, part 1 of A History of American Christianity by Leonard Woolsey Bacon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Chapter 18, part 1, The Great Immigration. At the taking of the first census of the United States in 1790, the country contained a population of about 4 millions in its territory of less than 1 million of square miles. 60 years later, at the census of 1850, it contained a population of more than 23 millions in its territory of about 3 millions of square miles. The vast expansion of territory to more than threefold the original great domain of the United States had been made by honorable purchase or less honorable conquest. It had not added largely to the population of the nation. The new acquisitions were mainly of unoccupied land. The increase of the population, down to about 1845, was chiefly the natural increase of a hardy and prolific stock under conditions in the highest degree favorable to such an increase. Up to the year 1820, the recent immigration had been inconsiderable. In the 10 years 1820 to 29, the annual arrival of immigrants was 9,000. In the next decade, 1830 to 39, the annual arrival was nearly 35,000, or 100 a day. For 40 years, the total immigration from all quarters was much less than 500,000. In the course of the next 3 decades, from 1840 to 1869, there arrived in the United States from the various countries of Europe 5.5 millions of people. It was more than the entire population of the country at the time of the first census. A multitude like which the populous North poured never from her frozen loins to pass, Rhine or the Danau, when her barbarous sons came like a deluge on the south and spread beneath Gibraltar to the Libyan sands. Under the pressure of a less copious flood of incursion, the greatest empire in all history, strongest in arts and polity as well as arms, had perished utterly. If Rome, with her population of 120 millions, her genius for war and government, and her long compacted civilization, succumbed under a less sudden rush of invasion, what hope was there for the young American Republic, with its scanty population and its new and untried institutions? An impressive providential combination of causes determined this great historic movement of population at this time. It was effected by attractions in front of the emigrant, reinforced by impulses from behind. The conclusion of the peace of 1815 was followed by the beginning of an era of great public works, one of the first of which was the digging of the Erie Canal. This sort of enterprise makes an immediate demand for large forces of unskilled laborers, and in both hemispheres it has been observed to occasion movements of population out of Catholic countries into Protestant countries. The westward current of the indigenous population created a vacuum in the seaboard states, and a demand for labor that was soon felt in the labor markets of the Old World. a liberal homestead policy on the part of the national government, and naturalization laws that were more than liberal, agencies for the encouragement of settlers organized by individual states and by railroad corporations and other great landed proprietors, and the eager competition of steamship companies drumming for steerage passengers in all parts of Europe, all these cooperated with the growing facility and cheapness of steam transportation to swell the current of migration. The discovery of gold in California quickened the flow of it. As if it had been the divine purpose not only to draw forth, but to drive forth, the populations of the Old World to make their homes in the New, there was added to all these causes conducive to migration the Irish famine of 1846 and '47, and the feudal revolutions of 1848, with the tyrannical reactions which followed them. But the great stimulus to migration was the success and prosperity that attended it. It was success that succeeded. The great emigration agent was the letter written to his old home by the new settler, in multitudes of cases enclosing funds to pay the passage of friends whom he had left behind him. The great immigration that began about 1845 is distinguished from some of the early colonizations in that it was in no sense a religious movement. Very grave religious results were to issue from it, but they were to be achieved through the unconscious coöperation of a multitude of individuals, each intent with the singleness of vision on his own individual ends. It is by such unconscious coöperation that the directing mind and the overruling hand of God in history are most signally illustrated. In the first rush of this increased immigration, by far the greatest contributor of the new population was Ireland. It not only surpassed any other country in the number of its immigrants, but in the height of the Irish exodus, in the decade 1840 50, it nearly equaled all other countries of the world together. The incoming Irish millions were almost solidly Roman Catholic. The measures taken by the British government for many generations to attach the Irish people to the crown and convert them to the English standard of Protestantism had had the result of discharging upon our shores a people distinguished above all Christendom besides for its ardent and unreserved devotion to the Roman Church, and hardly less distinguished for its hatred to England. After the first flood tide, the relative number of the Irish immigrants began to decrease, and has kept on decreasing until now. Since the Civil War, the chief source of immigration has been Germany, and its contributions to our population have greatly aggrandized the Lutheran denomination, once so inconsiderable in numbers, until in many Western cities it is the foremost of the Protestant communions, and in Chicago outnumbers the communicants of the Episcopalian, the Presbyterian, and the Methodist churches combined. The German immigration has contributed its share, and probably more than its share, to our non-religious and churchless population. Withal, in a proportion which it is not easy to ascertain with precision, it added multitudinous thousands to the sudden and enormous growth of the Roman Catholic Church. But there is an instructive contrast between the German immigrations, whether Catholic or Protestant, and the Irish immigration. The Catholicism of the Irish, held from generation to generation in the face of partisan and sometimes cruelly persecuting laws, was held with the ardor, if not of personal conviction, of at least strong hereditary animosity. To the Germans, the religious sect, whether Catholic, Lutheran, or Reformed, is determined for them by political arrangement, under the principle cujus regio, ejus religio. It is matter of course that tenets thus acquired should be held by a tenure so far removed from fanaticism as to seem to more zealous souls much like lukewarmness. Accustomed to have the cost of religious institutions provided for in the budget of public expenses, the wards of the old world state churches find themselves here in strange surroundings, untrained in habits of self-denial for religious objects. The danger is a grave and real one that before they become acclimated to the new conditions a large percentage will be lost, not only from their hereditary communion, but from all Christian fellowship, and lapse into simple indifferentism and godlessness. They have much to learn and something to teach. The indigenous American churches are not likely to be docile learners at the feet of alien teachers, but it would seem like the slighting of a providential opportunity if the older sect should fail to recognize that one of the greatest and by far the most rapidly growing of the Protestant churches of America, the Lutheran, growing now with new increments not only from the German, but also the Scandinavian nations, is among us in such force to teach us somewhat by its example of the equable, systematic, and methodical ways of a state church, as well as to learn something from the irregular fervor of that revivalism which its neighbors on every hand have inherited from the Great Awakening. It would be the very extravagance of national self-conceit if the older American churches should become possessed of the idea that 4 millions of German Christians and 1 million of Scandinavians arriving here from 1860 to 1890 with their characteristic methods in theology and usages of worship and habit of church organization and administration, were here, in the providence of God, only to be assimilated and not at all to assimilate. The vast growth of the Roman Catholic Church in America could not but fill its clergy and adherents with wonder and honest pride. But it was an occasion of immense labors and not a little anxiety. One effect of the enormous immigration was inevitably to impose upon this church, according to the popular apprehension, the character of a foreign association, and in the earlier periods of the influx, of an Irish association. It was in like manner inevitable, from the fact that the immigrant classes are preponderantly poor and of low social rank, that it should for 2 or 3 generations be looked upon as a church for the illiterate and unskilled laboring class. An incident of the excessive torrent rush of the immigration was that the Catholic Church became to a disproportionate extent an urban institution, making no adequate provision for the dispersed in agricultural regions. Against these and other like disadvantages the hierarchy of the Catholic Church have struggled heroically, with some measure of success. The steadily rising character of the imported population in its successive generations has aided them. If in the first generations the churches were congregations of immigrants served by an imported clergy, the most strenuous exertions were made for the founding of institutions that should secure to future congregations born upon the soil the services of an American trained priesthood. One serious hindrance to the noble advances that have nevertheless been made in this direction has been the fanatical opposition levied against even the most beneficent enterprises of the church by a bigoted native Americanism. It is not a hopeful method of conciliating and naturalizing a foreign element in the community to treat them with suspicion and hostility as alien enemies. The shameful persecution which the mob was for a brief time permitted to inflict on Catholic churches and schools and convents had for its chief effect to confirm the foreigner in his adherence to his church and his antipathy to Protestantism, and to provoke a twofold ferocity in return. At a time when there was reason to apprehend a Know-Nothing riot in New York in 1844, a plan was concerted and organized by a large Irish society with divisions throughout the city, by which, in case a single church was attacked, buildings should be fired in all quarters and the great city should be involved in a general conflagration. The utmost that could have been hoped for by the devoted but inadequate body of the Roman Catholic clergy in America, overwhelmed by an influx of their people coming in upon them in increasing volume, numbering millions per annum, was that they might be able to hold their own. But this hope was very far from being attained. How great have been the losses to the Roman communion through the transplantation of its members across the sea is a question to which most widely varying answers have been given, and on which statistical exactness seems unattainable. The various estimates, agreeing in nothing else, agree in representing them as enormously great. All good men will also agree that in so far as these losses represent mere lapses into unbelief and irreligion, they are to be deplored. Happily there is good evidence of a large salvage, gathered into other churches, from what so easily becomes a shipwreck of faith with total loss. It might seem surprising, in view of the many and diverse resources of attractive influence which the Roman Church has at its command, that its losses have not been to some larger extent compensated by conversions from other sects. Instances of such conversion are by no means wanting, but so far as a popular current toward Catholicism is concerned, the attractions in that direction are outweighed by the disadvantages already referred to. It has not been altogether a detriment to the Catholic Church in America that the social status and personal composition of its congregations, in its earlier years, have been such that the transition into it from any of the Protestant churches could be made only at the cost of a painful self-denial. The numbers of accessions to it have been thereby lessened, but, leaving out the case of the transition of politicians from considerations of expediency, the quality of them has been severely sifted. Incomparably the most valued acquisition which the American Catholic Church has received has been the company of devoted and gifted young men, deeply imbued with the principles and sentiments of the High Church party in the Episcopal Church, who have felt constrained in conscience and in logic to take the step, which seems so short, from the highest level in the Anglican Church into the Roman, and who, organizing into the order of the Paulist Fathers, have exemplified in the Roman Church so many of the highest qualities of Protestant preaching. He is a bold man who will undertake to predict in detail the future of the Roman Church in America. To say that it will be modified by its surroundings is only to say what is true of it in all countries. To say that it will be modified for the better is to say what is true of it in all Protestant countries. Nowhere is the Roman Church so pure from scandal and so effective for good as where it is closely surrounded and jealously scrutinized by bodies of its fellow Christians whom it is permitted to recognize only as heretics. But when the influence of surrounding heresy is seen to be an indispensable blessing to the Church, the heretic himself comes to be looked upon with a mitigated horror. Not with the sacrifice of any principle, but through the application of some of those provisions by which the Latin theology is able to meet exigencies like this, the allowance in favor of invincible ignorance and prejudice, the distinction between body and the soul of the Church, the Roman Catholic, recognizing the Spirit of Christ in his Protestant fellow Christian, is able to hold him in spiritual if not formal communion, so that the Catholic Church may prove itself not dissevered from the Church Catholic. In the common duties of citizenship and of humanity, in the promotion of the interests of morality, even in those religious matters that are of common concern to all honest disciples of Jesus Christ, he is at one with his heretic brethren. Without the change of a single item either of doctrine or of discipline, the attitude and temper of the Church, as compared with the Church of Spain or Italy or Mexico, is revolutionized. The change must needs draw it with other changes, which may not come without some jar and conflict between progressive and conservative, but which nevertheless needs must come. Out of many indications of the spirit of fellowship with all Christians now exemplified among American Catholics, I quote one of the most recent and authoritative from an address of Archbishop Ryan at the Catholic Congress in Chicago in 1893. Speaking on Christian union, he said: "If there is any one thing more than another upon which people agree, it is respect and reverence for the person and the character of the founder of Christianity. How the Protestant loves his Savior! How the Protestant eye will sometimes grow dim when speaking of our Lord! In this great center of union is found the hope of human society, the only means of preserving Christian civilization, the only point upon which Catholic and Protestant may meet. As if foreseeing that this should be, Christ himself gave his example of fraternal charity, not to the Orthodox Jew, but to the heretical Samaritan, showing that charity and love, while faith remains intact, can never be true unless no distinction is made between God's creatures. Herein is a fellowship higher than that of symbols and sacraments. By so far as it receives this spirit of love, the American Catholic Church enters into its place in that greater Catholic Church of which we all make mention in the Apostles' Creed, the Holy Universal Church, which is the fellowship of holy souls." The effect of the great immigration on the body of the immigrant population is not more interesting or more important than the effect of it on the religious bodies already in occupation of the soil. The impression made on them by what seemed an irruption of barbarians of strange language or dialect, for the most part rude, unskilled, and illiterate, shunning as profane the Christian churches of the land, and bowing in unknown rites as devotees of a system known, and by no means favorably known, only through polemic literature and history, and through the gruesome traditions of Puritan and Presbyterian and Huguenot, was an impression not far removed from horror, and this impression was deepened as the enormous proportions of this invasion disclosed themselves from year to year. The serious and not unreasonable fear that these armies of aliens, handled as they manifestly were by a generalship that was quick to seize and fortify in a conspicuous way the strategic points of influence, especially in the new states, might imperil or ruin the institutions and liberties of the young republic, was stimulated and exploited in the interest of enterprises of evangelization that might counterwork the operations of the invading church. The appeals of the Bible and Tract societies and of the various home mission agencies of the different denominations, as well as of the distinctly antipopery societies, were pointed with the alarm lest the great West should fall under the domination of the papal hierarchy. Naturally, the delineations of the Roman system and of its public and social results that were presented to the public for these purposes were of no flattering character. Not history only, but contemporary geography gave warnings of peril. Canada on one hand, and Mexico and the rest of Spanish America on the other, were cited as living examples of the fate which might befall the free United States. The apocalyptic prophecies were copiously drawn upon for material of war. By processes of exegesis, which critical scholarship regards with a smile or a shudder, the helpless pope was made to figure as the Antichrist, the man of sin and the son of perdition, the scarlet woman on the 7 hills, the little horn speaking blasphemies, the beast, and the great red dragon. That moiety of Christendom which, sorely as its history has been deformed by corruption and persecution, Violently as it seems to be contrasted with the simplicity of the primeval church, is nevertheless the spiritual home of multitudes of Christ's well-appointed servants and disciples, was held up to gaze as being nothing but the enemy of Christ and his cause. The appetite of the Protestant public for scandals at the expense of their fellow Christians was stimulated to a morbid greediness, and then overfed with willful and wicked fabrications. The effect of this fanaticism on some honest but illogical minds was what might have been looked for. Brought by and by into personal acquaintance with Catholic ministers and institutions, and discovering the fraud and injustice that had been perpetrated, they sprang by a generous reaction into an attitude of sympathy for the Roman Catholic system. A more favorable preparation of the way of conversion to Rome could not be desired by the skillful propagandist. One recognizes a retributive justice in the fact, when notable gains to the Catholic Church are distinctly traced to the reaction of honest men from these fraudulent polemics. The danger to the Republic, which was thus malignantly or ignorantly exaggerated and distorted, was nevertheless real and grave. No sincerely earnest and religious Protestant, nor even any well-informed patriotic citizen, with the example of French and Spanish America before his eyes, could look with tolerance upon the prospect of a possible Catholicizing of the new states at the West, and the sight of the incessant tide of immigration setting westward, the reports of large funds sent hither from abroad to aid the propagation of the Roman Church, and the accounts of costly and imposing ecclesiastical buildings rising at the most important centers of population, roused the Christian patriotism of the older states to the noblest enterprises of evangelization. There was no wasting of energy in futile disputation. In all the Protestant communions it was felt that the work called for was a simple, peaceful, and positive one, to plant the soil of the West, at the first occupation of it by settlers, with Christian institutions and influences. The immensity of the task stimulated rather than dismayed the zeal of the various churches. The work undertaken and accomplished in the 20 years from 1840 to 1860, in providing the newly settled regions with churches, pastors, colleges, and theological seminaries, with Sunday schools, and with Bibles and other religious books, was of a magnitude which will never be defined by statistical figures. How great it was, and at what cost it was effected, in gifts of treasure and of heroic lives of toil and self-denial, can only be a matter of vague wonder and thanksgiving. End of chapter 18, part 1. Chapter 18, Part 2 of A History of American Christianity by Leonard Woolsey Bacon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Chapter 18, Part 2, The Great Immigration. The work of planting the church in the West exhibits the voluntary system at its best and at its worst. A task so vast and so momentous has never been imposed on the resources of any state establishment. It is safe to say that no established church has ever existed, however imperially endowed, that would have been equal to the undertaking of it. With no imposing combination of forces and no strategic concert of action, the work was begun spontaneously and simultaneously, like some of the operations of nature, by a multitude of different agencies, and went forward uninterrupted to something as nearly like completeness as could be in a work the exigencies of which continually widened beyond all achievements. The planting of the church in the West is one of the wonders of church history. But this noble act of religious devotion was by no means a sacrifice without blemish. The sacred zeal for advancing God's reign and righteousness was mingled with many very human motives in the progress of it. Conspicuous among these was the spirit of sectarian competition. The worthy and apostolic love for kindred according to the flesh, separated from home and exposed to the privations and temptations of the frontier, the honest anxiety to forestall the domination of a dangerously powerful religious corporation propagating perverted views of truth, even the desire to advance principles and forms of belief deemed to be important, were infused with a spirit of partisanship as little spiritual as the enthusiasm which animates the struggles and the shouters at a football game. The devoted pioneer of the gospel on the frontier, seeing his work endangered by that of a rival denomination, writes to the central office of his sect. The Board of Missions makes its appeal to the contributing churches. The churches respond with subsidies, and the local rivalry in the mission field is pressed, sometimes to a good result, on the principle that competition is the life of business. Thus the fragrance of the precious ointment of loving sacrifice is perceptibly tainted, according to the warning of Ecclesiastes or the preacher. And yet it is not easy for good men, being men, sternly to rebuke the spirit that seems to be effective in promoting the good cause that they have at heart. If the effects of these emulations on the contributing churches was rather carnal than spiritual, the effect in the mission field was worse. The effect was seen in the squandering of money and of priceless service of good men and women, in the debilitating and demoralizing division and subdivision of Christian people, not of cities and large towns, but of villages and hamlets and of thinly settled farming districts. By the building of churches and other edifices for sectarian uses, schism was established for coming time as a vested interest. The gifts and service bestowed in this cause with a truly magnificent liberality would have sufficed to establish the Christian faith and fellowship throughout the new settlements in strength and dignity, in churches which, instead of lingering as puny and dependent nurslings, would have grown apace to be strong and healthy nursing mothers to newer churches yet. There is an instructive contrast, not only between the working of the voluntary system and that of the Old World establishments, but between the methods of the Catholic Church and the Protestant no method. Under the control of a strong coordinating authority, the competitions of the various Catholic orders, however sharp, could never be allowed to run into wasteful extravagance through cross purposes. It is believed that the Catholics have not erected many monuments of their own unthrift in the shape of costly buildings begun, but left unfinished and abandoned. A more common incident of their work has been the buying up of these expensive failures, at a large reduction from their cost, and turning them to useful service. And yet the principle of sectarian competition is both recognized and utilized in the Roman system. The various clerical sects, with their characteristic names, costumes, methods, and doctrinal differences, have their recognized aptitudes for various sorts of work, with which their names are strongly associated. The Dominican for pulpit eloquence, the Capuchin for rough and ready street preaching, the Benedictine for literary work, the Sulpician for the training of priests, and the ubiquitous Jesuit for shifty, general utility with a specialty of school keeping. These and a multitude of other orders, male and female, have been effectively and usefully employed in the arduous labor Romanum condere gentem. But it would seem that the superior stability of the present enterprise of planting Catholicism in the domain of the United States, as compared with former expensive failures, was due in some part to the larger employment of a diocesan parish clergy instead of a disproportionate reliance on the regulars. On the whole, notwithstanding its immense armies of immigrants and the devoted labors of its priests, and notwithstanding its great expansion, visible everywhere in conspicuous monuments of architecture, the Catholic advance in America has not been, comparatively speaking, successful. For one thing, the campaign was carried on too far from its base of supplies. The subsidies from Lyons and Vienna, liberal as they were no match for the home missionary zeal of the seaboard states in following their own sons westward with church and gospel and pastor. Even the conditions which made possible the superior management and economy of resources, both material and personal, among the Catholics, were attended with compensating drawbacks. With these advantages they could not have the immense advantage of the popular initiative. In Protestantism the people were the church, and the minister was chief among the people only by virtue of being servant of all. The people were incited to take up the work for their own, and carry it on at their best discretion, and they were free to make wasteful and disastrous blunders and learn therefrom by experience. With far greater expenditure of funds, they make no comparison with their brethren of the Roman obedience in stately and sumptuous buildings at great centers of commerce and travel. But they have covered the face of the land with country meeting houses, twice as many as there was any worthy use for, in which faithful service is rendered to subdivided congregations by underpaid ministers, enough in number, if they were wisely distributed, for the evangelization of the whole continent. And each country meeting house is a mission station, and its congregation, men, women, and children, are missionaries. Thus it has come about, in the language of the earnest Catholic from the once Catholic city of New Orleans, that the nation, the government, the whole people, remain solidly Protestant. Great territories originally discovered by Catholic explorers and planted in the name of the Church by Catholic missionaries and colonists, and more lately occupied by Catholic immigrants in what seemed overwhelming numbers, are now the seat of free and powerful commonwealths in which the Catholic Church is only one of the most powerful and beneficent of the Christian sects, while the institutions and influences which characterize their society are predominantly Protestant. In the westward propagation of Protestantism, as well as of Catholicism, the distinctive attributes of the several sects or orders is strikingly illustrated. Foremost in the pioneer work of the Church are easily to be recognized the Methodists and the Baptists, one the most solidly organized of the Protestant sects, the other the most uncompact and individualist, the first by virtue of the supple military organization of its great corps of itinerants, the other by the simplicity and popular apprehensibleness of its distinctive tenets and arguments and the aggressive ardor with which it inspires all its converts, and both by their facility in recruiting their ministry from the rank and file of the church without excluding any by arbitrarily imposed conditions. The Presbyterians were heavily cumbered for advance work by traditions and rules which they were rigidly reluctant to yield or bend, even when the reason for the rule was superseded by higher reasons. The argument for a learned ministry is doubtless a weighty one, but it does not suffice to prove that when college-bred men are not to be had, it is better that the people have no minister at all. There is virtue in the rule of ministerial parity, but it should not be allowed to hinder the church from employing in humbler spiritual functions men who fall below the prescribed standard. This the church in course of time discovered and instituted a minor order of ministers, under the title of colporteurs. But it was timidly and tardily done, and therefore ineffectively. The Presbyterians lost their place in the skirmish line, but that which had been their hindrance in the advance work gave them great advantage in settled communities, in which for many years they took precedence in the building up of strong and intelligent congregations. To the Congregationalists belongs an honor in the past which, in recent generations, they have not been jealous to retain. Beyond any sect, except the Moravians, they have cherished that charity which seeketh not her own. The earliest leaders in the organization of schemes of national beneficence in cooperation with others, they have sustained them with unselfish liberality, without regard to returns of sectarian advantage. The results of their labor are largely to be traced in the upbuilding of other sects. Their specialty in evangelization has been that of the religious educators of the nation. They have been preeminently the builders of colleges and theological seminaries. To them also belongs the leadership in religious journalism. Not only the journals of their own sect and the undenominational journals, but also to a notable extent the religious journals of other denominations, have depended for their efficiency on men bred in the discipline of Congregationalism. It is no just reproach to the Episcopalians that they were tardy in entering the field of home missions. When we remember that it is only since 1811 that they have emerged from numerical insignificance, we find their contribution to the planting of the church in the new settlements to be a highly honorable one. By a suicidal compact, the guileless evangelical party agreed in 1835 to take direction of the foreign missions of the church, and leave the home field under the direction of the aggressive High Church party. It surrendered its part in the future of the church, and determined the type of Episcopalianism that was to be planted in the West. Entering thus late into the work, and that with stinted resources, the Episcopal Church wholly missed the apostolic glory of not building on other men's foundations. Coming with the highest pretensions to exclusive authority, its work was very largely a work of proselyting from other Christian sects. But this work was prosperously carried on, and although not in itself a work of the highest dignity, and although the methods of it often bore a painfully schismatic character, there is little room for doubt that the results of it have enriched and strengthened the common Christianity of America. Its specialties in the planting work have been the setting of a worthy example of dignity and simplicity in the conduct of divine worship, and in the general of efficiency in the administration of a parish, and above all, the successful handling of the immensely difficult duties imposed upon Christian congregations in great cities, where the Episcopal Church has its chief strength and its most effective work. One must needs ascend to a certain altitude above the common level in order to discern a substantial resultant unity of movement in the strenuous rivalries and even antagonisms of the many sects of the one Church of Christ in America in that critical quarter century from the year 1835 to the outbreak of the Civil War, in which the work of the Church was suddenly expanded by the addition of a whole empire of territory on the west, and the bringing in of a whole empire of alien population from the east, and when no one of the Christian forces of the nation could be spared from the field. The unity is very real, and visible enough, doubtless, from the circle of the heavens. The sharers in the toil and conflict and the near spectators are not well placed to observe it. It will be for historians in some later century to study it in a truer perspective. It is not only as falling within this period of immigration, but as being largely dependent on its accessions from foreign lands, that the growth of Mormonism is entitled to mention in this chapter. In its origin, Mormonism is distinctly American, a system of gross, palpable imposture contrived by a disreputable adventurer, Joe Smith, with the aid of 3 confederates, who afterward confessed the fraud and perjury of which they had been guilty. It is a shame to human nature that the silly lies put forth by this precious gang should have found believers. But the solemn pretensions to divine revelation, mixed with elements borrowed from the prevalent revivalism and from the immediate Adventism which so easily captivates excitable imaginations, drew a number of honest dupes into the train of the knavish leaders, and made possible the pitiable history which followed. The chief recruiting grounds for the new religion were not in America, but in the manufacturing and mining regions of Great Britain, and in some of the countries, especially the Scandinavian countries, of continental Europe. The able handling of an emigration fund and the dexterous combination of appeals to many passions and interests at once have availed to draw together in the state of Utah and neighboring regions a body of fanatics formidable to the republic, not by their number, for they count only about 150,000, but by the solidity with which they are compacted into a political, economical, religious, and at need military community, handled at will by unscrupulous chiefs. It is only incidentally that the strange story of the Mormons, a story singularly dramatic and sometimes tragic, is connected with the history of American Christianity. To this same period belongs the beginning of the immigration of the Chinese, which, like that of the Mormons, becomes by and by important to our subject as furnishing occasion for active and fruitful missionary labors. In the year 1843 culminated the panic agitation of Millerism. From the year 1831 an honest Vermont farmer named William Miller had been urging upon the public, in pamphlets and lectures, his views of the approaching advent of Christ to judgment and the destruction of the world. He had it figured out on the basis of prophecies in Daniel and the Revelation, and the great event was set down for April 23, 1843. As the date drew near, the excitement of many became intense. Great meetings were held, in open air or in tents, of those who wished to be found waiting for the Lord. Some nobly proved their sincerity by the surrender of their property for the support of the poorer brethren until the end should come. The awful day was awaited with glowing rapture of hope, or by some with terror. When it dawned, there was an eager gazing upon the clouds of heaven to descry the sign of the Son of Man. And when the day had passed without event, there were various revulsions of feeling. The prophets set themselves to going over their figures and fixing new dates. Earnest believers, sobered by the failure of their pious expectations, held firmly to the substance of their faith and hope, while no longer attempting to know times and seasons which the Father hath put within his own power. Weak minds made shipwreck of faith, and scoffers cried in derision, "Where is this promise of his coming?" A monument of this honest illusion still exists in the not very considerable sect of Adventists, with its subdivisions, but sympathizers with their general scheme of prophetical interpretation are to be found among the most earnest and faithful members of other churches. Such has been the progress of scriptural knowledge since the days when Farmer Miller went to work with his arithmetic and slate upon the strange symbols and enigmatic figures of the Old and New Testament apocalypses, that plain Christians everywhere have now the means of knowing that the lines of calculation along which good people were led into delusion a half century ago started from utterly fallacious premises. It is to the fidelity of critical scholars that we owe it that hereafter, except among the ignorant and unintelligent, these two books, now clearly understood, will not again be used to minister to the panic of a Millerite craze, nor to furnish vituperative epithets for antipopery agitators. To this period also must be referred the rise of that system of necromancy which, originating in America, has had great vogue in other countries, and here in its native land has taken such form as really to constitute a new cult. Making no mention of sporadic instances of what in earlier generations would have been called, and properly enough, by the name of witchcraft, we find the beginning of so-called spiritualism in the Rochester rappings, produced, to the wonder of many witnesses, by the Fox girls in 1849. How the rappings and other sensible phenomena were produced was a curious question, but not important. The main question was, did they convey communications from the spirits of the dead, as the young women alleged, and as many persons believed, so they thought, from demonstrative evidence? The mere suggestion of the possibility of this of course awakened an inquisitive and eager interest everywhere. It became the subject of universal discussion and experiment in society. There was demand for other mediums to satisfy curiosity or aid investigation, and the demand at once produced a copious supply. The business of medium became a regular profession, opening a career especially to enterprising women. They began to draw together believers and doubters into circles and seances, and to organize permanent associations. At the end of 10 years, the Spiritual Register for 1859, boasting great things, estimated the actual spiritualists in America at 1,500,000, besides 4 million or more partly converted. The latest census gives the total membership of their associations as 45,030. But this moderate figure should not be taken as the measure of the influence of their leading tenet. There are not a few honest Christians who are convinced that communications do sometimes take place between the dead and the living. There are a great multitude who are disposed in a vague way to think there must be something in it. But there are few even of the earnest devotees of the spiritualist cult who will deny that the whole business is infested with fraud, whether of dishonest mediums or of lying spirits. Of late years the general public has come into possession of material for independent judgment on this point. An earnest spiritualist, a man of wealth, named Siebert, dying, left to the University of Pennsylvania a legacy of $60,000, on condition that the university should appoint a commission to investigate the claims of spiritualism. A commission was appointed which left nothing to be desired in point of ability, integrity, and impartiality. Under the presidency of the renowned Professor Joseph Leidy, and with the aid and advice of leading believers in spiritualism, they made a long, patient, faithful investigation, the processes and results of which are published in a most amusing little volume. The gist of their report may be briefly summed up. Every case of alleged communication from the world of departed spirits that was investigated by the commission, and they were guided in their selection of cases by the advice of eminent and respectable believers in spiritualism, was discovered and demonstrated to be a case of gross, willful, attempted fraud. The evidence is strong that the organized system of spiritualism in America, with its associations and lyceums and annual camp meetings, and its itinerancy of mediums and trance speakers, is a system of mere imposture. In the honest simplicity of many of its followers, and in the wicked mendacity of its leaders, it seems to be on par with the other American contribution to the religion of the world, Mormonism. End of chapter 18, part 2. Chapter 19 of A History of American Christianity by Leonard Woolsey Bacon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Chapter 19, The Civil War. It has been observed that for nearly half a generation after the reaction began from the fervid excitement of the Millerite agitation, no season of general revival was known in the American church. These were years of immense material prosperity, the golden age of our history. The wealth of the nation in that time far more than doubled, its railroad mileage more than threefold, population moved westward with rapidity and volume beyond precedent. Between 1845 and 1860 there were admitted 7 new states and 4 organized territories. Withal, it was a time of continually deepening intensity of political agitation. The patchwork of compromises and settlements contrived by makeshift politicians like Clay and Douglas would not hold. They tore out, and the rent was made worse. Part of the Compromise of 1850, which was to be something altogether sempiternal, was a fugitive slave law so studiously base and wicked in its provisions as to stir the indignation of just and generous men whenever it was enforced, and to instruct and strengthen and consolidate an intelligent and conscientious opposition to slavery as not a century of anti-slavery lecturing and pamphleteering could have done. 4 years later, the sagacious Stephen Douglas introduced into Congress his ingenious permanent pacification scheme for taking the slavery question out of politics by perfidiously repealing the act under which the Western territories had for the third part of a century been pledged to freedom, and leaving the question of freedom or slavery to be decided by the first settlers upon the soil. It was understood on both sides that the effect of this measure would be to turn over the soil of Kansas to slavery, and for a moment there was a calm that did almost seem like peace. But the providential man for the emergency, Eli Thayer, boldly accepted the challenge under all the disadvantageous conditions, and appealed to the friends of freedom and righteousness to stand by him in the Kansas crusade. The appeal was to the same Christian sentiment which had just uttered its vain protest, through the almost unanimous voice of the ministers of the gospel, against the opening of the territories to the possibility of slavery. It was taken up in the solemn spirit of religious duty. None who were present are likely to forget the scene when the emigrants from New Haven assembled in the North Church to be sped on their way with prayer and benediction, how the vast multitude were thrilled by the noble eloquence of Beecher, and how money came out of pocket when it was proposed to equip the columnists with arms for self-defense against the ferocity of border ruffians. There were scenes like this in many a church and country prayer meeting, where Christian hearts did not forget to pray for them in bonds as bound with them. There took place such a religious emigration as America had not known since the days of the first colonists. They went forth singing the words of Whittier: "We crossed the prairies as of old our fathers crossed the sea, to make the West, as they the East, the empire of the free." Those were choice companies. It was said that in some of their settlements every third man was a college graduate. Thus it was, not all at once, but after desperate tribulations, Kansas was saved for freedom. It was the turning point in the irrepressible conflict. The beam of the scales, which politicians had for 40 years been trying to hold level, dipped in favor of liberty and justice, and it was hopeless thenceforth to restore the balance. Neither of the two characteristics of this time, the abounding material prosperity or the turbid political agitation, was favorable to that fixed attention to spiritual themes which promotes the revival of religion. But the conditions were about to be suddenly changed. Suddenly, in the fall of 1857, came a business revulsion. Hard times followed. Men had leisure for thought and prayer, and anxieties that they were fain to cast upon God, seeking help and direction. The happy thought occurred to a good man, Jeremiah Lanphier, in the employ of the old North Dutch Church in New York, to open a room in the Consistory Building in Fulton Street as an oratory for the common prayer of so many business men as might be disposed to gather there in the hour from 12 to 1 o'clock, with one accord to make their common supplications. The invitation was responded to at first by hardly more than 2 or 3. The number grew. The room overflowed. A second room was opened, and then a third, in the same building, till all its walls resounded with prayer and song. The example was followed till at one time, in the spring of 1858, no fewer than 20 daily Union prayer meetings were sustained in different parts of the city. Besides these, there was preaching at unwonted times and places. Burton's Theater on Chambers Street, in the thick of the business houses, was thronged with eager listeners to the rudimental truths of personal religion, expounded and applied by great preachers. Everywhere the cardinal topics of practical religious duty, repentance, and Christian faith were themes of social conversation. All churches and ministers were full of activity and hope. They that feared the Lord spake often one with another. What was true of New York was true in its measure of every city, village, and hamlet in the land. It was the Lord's doing, marvelous in men's eyes. There was no human leadership or concert of action bringing it about. It came. Not only were there no notable evangelists traveling the country, even the pastors of churches did little more than enter zealously into their happy duty in things made ready to their hand. Elsewhere, as at New York, the work began with the spontaneous gathering of private Christians, stirred by an unseen influence. Two circumstances tended to promote the diffusion of the revival. The Young Men's Christian Association, then a recent but rapidly spreading institution, furnished a natural center in each considerable town for mutual consultation and mutual incitement among young men of various sects. For this was another trait of the revival, that it went forward as a tide movement of the whole church, in disregard of the dividing lines of sect. I know not what Christian communion, if any, was unaffected by it. The other favorable circumstance was the business interest taken in the revival by the secular press. Up to this time the church had been little accustomed to look for cooperation to the newspaper, unless it was the religious weekly. But at this time that was fulfilled which was spoken of the prophet, that holiness to the Lord should be written upon the trains of commerce and upon all secular things. The sensation headlines in enterprising journals proclaimed revival news, and smart reporters were detailed to the prayer meeting or the sermon as having greater popular interest for the time than the criminal trial or the political debate. Such papers as the Tribune and the Herald, laying on men's breakfast tables and counting-room desks the latest pungent word from the noon prayer meeting or evening sermon, did the work of many tract societies. As the immediate result of the revival of 1857 to 58, it has been estimated that 1,000,000 of members were added to the fellowship of the churches. But the ulterior result was greater. This revival was the introduction to a new era of the nation's spiritual life. It was the training school for a force of lay evangelists for future work, eminent among whom is the name of Dwight Moody. And, like the Great Awakening of 1740, it was the providential preparation of the American church for an immediately impending peril, the gravity of which there were none at the time far-sighted enough to predict. Looking backward, it is instructive for us to raise the question how the church would have passed through the decade of the 60s without the spiritual reinforcement that came to it amid the Pentecostal scenes of 1857 and 1858. And yet there were those among the old men who were ready to weep as they compared the building of the Lord's house with what they had known in their younger days. No sustained enforcement on the mind and conscience of alarming and heart-searching doctrines, no protracted meetings in which from day to day the warnings and invitations of the gospel were set forth before the hesitating mind, in the converts no severe and thorough law work, from the agonizing throes of which the soul was with no brief travail born to newness of life, but the free invitation, the ready and glad acceptance, the prompt enrollment on the Lord's side.
Did not these things betoken a superficial piety, springing up like seed in the thin soil of rocky places? It was a question for later years to answer, and perhaps we have not the whole of the answer yet. Certainly the work was not as in the days of Edwards and Brainerd, nor as in the days of Nettleton and Finney. Was it not perhaps more like the work in the days of Barnabas and Paul and Peter? It does not appear that the spiritual awakening of 1857 had any effect in allaying the sharp controversy between Northern and Southern Christians on the subject of slavery. Perhaps it may have deepened and intensified it. The Southern apostasy from principles universally accepted in 1818 had become complete and, so far as any utterance was permitted to reach the public, unanimous. The Southern Methodists and the Southern Baptists had, a dozen years before, relieved themselves from liability to rebuke, whether express or implied, from their Northern brethren for complicity with crimes involved in slavery, by seceding from fellowship. Into the councils of the Episcopalians and the Catholics this great question of public morality was never allowed to enter. The Presbyterians were divided into two bodies, each having its Northern and Southern presbyteries, and the course of events in these two bodies may be taken as an indication of the drift of opinion and feeling. The Old School body, having a strong Southern element, remained silent, notwithstanding the open nullification of its declaration of 1818 by the Presbytery of Harmony, South Carolina, resolving that the existence of slavery is not opposed to the will of God, and the Synod of Virginia declaring that the General Assembly had no right to declare that relations sinful which Christ and his apostles teach to be consistent with the most unquestionable piety. The New School body, patient and considerate towards its Southern presbyteries, did not fail nevertheless to reassert the principles of righteousness, and in 1815 it declared slaveholding to be prima facie a subject of the discipline of the Church. In 1853 it called upon its Southern presbyteries to report what had been done in the case. One of them replied defiantly that its ministers and church members were slaveholders by choice and on principle. When the General Assembly condemned this utterance, the entire southern part of the church seceded and set up a separate jurisdiction. There seems no reason to doubt the entire sincerity with which the Southern Church, in all its sects, had consecrated itself with religious devotion to the maintenance of that horrible and inhuman form of slavery which had drawn upon itself the condemnation of the civilized world. The earnest anti-slavery convictions which had characterized it only 25 years before, violently suppressed from utterance, seem to have perished by suffocation. The common sentiment of Southern Christianity was expressed in that serious declaration of the Southern Presbyterian Church during the war of its deep conviction of the divine appointment of domestic servitude, and of the peculiar mission of the Southern Church to conserve the institution of slavery. At the North, on the other hand, with larger liberty, there was wider diversity of opinion. In general, the effect of continued discussion, of larger knowledge of facts, and of the enforcement on the common conscience, by the course of public events, of a sense of responsibility and duty in the matter, had been to make more intelligent, sober, and discriminating, and therefore more strong and steadfast, the resolution to keep clear of all complicity with slavery. There were few to assume the defense of that odious system, though there were some. There were many to object to scores of objectionable things in the conduct of abolitionists, and there were a very great number of honest, conscientious men who were appalled as they looked forward to the boldly threatened consequences of even the mildest action in opposition to slavery, the rending of the church, the ruin of the country, the horrors of civil war, and its uncertain event, issuing perhaps in the wider extension and firmer establishment of slavery itself. It was an immense power that the bold, resolute, rule or ruin supporters of the divine right of slavery held over the Christian public of the whole country, so long as they could keep these threats suspended in the air. It seemed to hold in the balance against a simple demand to execute righteousness toward a poor, oppressed, and helpless race, immense interests of patriotism, of humanity, of the kingdom of God itself. Presently the time came when these threats could no longer be kept aloft. The compliance demanded was clearly, decisively refused. The threats must either be executed or must fall to the ground amid general derision. But the moment that the threat was put in execution, its power as a threat had ceased. With the first stroke against the life of the nation, all great and noble motives, instead of being balanced against each other, were drawing together in the same direction. It ought not to have been a surprise to the religious leaders of disunion, ecclesiastical and political, to find that those who had most anxiously deprecated the attack upon the government should be among the most earnest and resolute to repeal the attack when made. No man can read the history of the American Church in the Civil War intelligently who does not apprehend, however great the effort, that the Christian people of the South did really and sincerely believe themselves to be commissioned by the providence of God to conserve the institution of slavery as an institution of divine appointment.
Strange as the conviction seems, it is sure that the conviction of conscience in the Southern army that it was right in waging war against the government of the country was as clear as the conviction on the other side of the duty of defending the government. The Southern regiments, like the Northern, were sent forth with prayer and benediction, and their camps, as well as those of their adversaries, were often the seats of earnest religious life. At the South, the entire able-bodied population was soon called into military service, so that almost the whole church was in the army. At the North, the churches at home hardly seemed diminished by the myriads sent to the field. It was amazing to see the charities and missions of the church sustained with almost undiminished supplies, while the great enterprises of the sanitary and Christian commissions were set on foot and magnificently carried forward for the physical, social, and spiritual good of the soldiers. Never was the gift of giving so abundantly bestowed on the church as in these stormy times. There was a feverish eagerness of life in all ways. If there was a too eager haste to make money among those that could be spared for business, there was a generous readiness in bestowing it. The little faith that expected to cancel and retrench, especially in foreign missions, in which it took sometimes $3 in the collection to put $1 into the work, was rebuked by the rising of the church to the height of the exigency. One religious lesson that was learned as never before, on both sides of the conflict, was the lesson of Christian fellowship as against the prevailing folly of sectarian divisions, emulations, and jealousies. There were great drawings in this direction in the early days of the war, when men of the most unlike antecedents and associations gathered on the same platform, intent on the same work, and mutual aversions and partisan antagonisms melted away in the fervent heat of a common religious patriotism. But the lesson which was commended at home was enforced in the camp and the regiment by constraint of circumstances. The army chaplain, however one side he might have been in his parish, had to be on all sides with his kindly sympathy as soon as he joined his regiment. He learned in a right apostolic sense to become all things to all men, and returning home he did not forget the lesson. The delight of a fellowship truly Catholic in the one work of Christ, once tasted, was not easily forgone. Already the current, perplexed with eddies, had begun to set in the direction of Christian unity. How much the common labors of Christian men and women, and Christian ministers of every different name, through the 5 years of bloody strife, contributed to swell and speed the current, no one can measure. According to a well-known law of the kingdom of heaven, the intense experiences of the war, both in the army and out of it, left no man just as he was before. To them that were exercised thereby, they brought great promotion in the service of the king. The cases are not few nor inconspicuous of men coming forth from the temptations and the discipline of the military service every way stronger and better Christians than they entered it. The whole church gained higher conceptions of the joy and glory of self-sacrifice, and deeper and more vivid insight into the significance of vicarious suffering and death. The war was a rude school of theology, but it taught some things well. The church had need of all that it could learn in preparation for the tasks and trials that were before it. There were those, on the other hand, who emerged from the military service depraved and brutalized, and those who, in the rush of business incidental to the war, were not trained to self-sacrifice and duty, but habituated to the seeking of selfish interests in the midst of the public peril and affliction. We delight in the evidences that these cases were a small proportion of the whole, but even a small percentage of so many hundreds and thousands mount up to a formidable total. The early years of peace were so marked by crimes of violence that a frequent heading in the daily newspapers was "The Carnival of Crime." Prosperity, or the semblance of it, came in like a sudden flood. Immigration of an improved character poured into the country in greater volume than ever. Multitudes made haste to be rich and fell into temptations and snares. The perilous era of enormous fortunes began. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20, Part 1 of A History of American Christianity by Leonard Woolsey Bacon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Chapter 20, Part 1, After the War. When the 5 years of rending and tearing had passed, in which slavery was dispossessed of its hold upon the nation, there was much to be done in reconstructing and readjusting the religious institutions of the country. Throughout the seceding states, buildings and endowments for religious uses had suffered in the general waste and destruction of property. Colleges and seminaries, in many instances, had seen their entire resources swept away through investment in the hopeless promises of the defeated government. Churches, boards, and like associations were widely disorganized through the vicissitudes of military occupation and the protracted absence or death of men of experience and capacity. The effect of the war upon denominational organizations had been various. There was no sect of all the church the members and ministers of which had not felt the sweep of the currents of popular opinion all about them.
but the course of events in each denomination was in some measure illustrative of the character of its polity. In the Roman Catholic Church the antagonisms of the conflict were as keenly felt as anywhere. Archbishop Hughes of New York, who, with Henry Ward Beecher and Bishop McIlvaine of Ohio, accepted a political mission from President Lincoln, was not more distinctly a Union man than Bishop Lynch of Charleston was a secessionist. But the firm texture of the hierarchical organization, held steadily in place by a central authority outside of the national boundaries, prevented any organic rupture. The Catholic Church in America was eminently fortunate at one point. The famous bull Quanta Cura, with its appended syllabus of damnable errors, in which almost all the essential characteristics of the institutions of the American public are anathematized, was fulminated in 1864, when people in the United States had little time to think of ecclesiastical events taking place at such a distance. If this extraordinary document had been first published in a time of peace, and freely discussed in the newspapers of the time, it could hardly have failed to inflict the most serious embarrassment on the interests of Catholicism in America. Even now it keeps the Catholic clergy in a constantly explanatory attitude, to show that the syllabus does not really mean what to the ordinary reader it unmistakably seems to mean, and the work of explanation is made the more necessary and the more difficult by the decree of papal infallibility, which followed the syllabus after a few years. Simply on the ground of a de facto political independence, the Southern dioceses of the Protestant Episcopal Church, following the principles and precedents of 1789, organized themselves into a church in the Confederate States. One of the Southern bishops, Polk of Louisiana, accepted a commission of major general in the Confederate Army, and relieved his brethren of any disciplinary questions that might have arisen in consequence by dying on the field from a cannon shot. With admirable tact and good temper, the Church in the United States managed to ignore the existence of any succession. And when the alleged de facto independence ceased, the seceding bishops and their dioceses dropped quietly back into place without leaving a trace of succession upon the record. The Southern organizations of the Methodists and Baptists were of 20 years' standing at the close of the war in 1865. The war had abolished the original cause of these divisions, but it had substituted others quite as serious. The exasperations of the war and the still more acrimonious exasperations of the period of the political reconstruction and of the organization of Northern missions at the South gendered strifes that still delay the reintegration which is so visibly future of both of these divided denominations. At the beginning of the war, one of the most important of the denominations that still retained large Northern and Southern membership in the same fellowship was the Old School Presbyterian Church, and no national sect had made larger concessions to avert a breach of unity. When the General Assembly met at Philadelphia in May, 1861, amid the intense excitements of the opening war, it was still the hope of the habitual leaders and managers of the Assembly to avert a division by holding back that body from any expression of sentiment on the question on which the minds of Christians were stirred at that time with a profound and most religious fervor. But the Assembly took the matter out of the hands of its leaders, and by a great majority, in the words of a solemn and temperate resolution drawn by the venerable and conservative Dr. Gardiner Spring, declared its loyalty to the government and constitution of the country. With expressions of horror at the sacrilege of taking the church into the domain of politics, Southern presbyteries one after another renounced the jurisdiction of the General Assembly that could be guilty of so shocking a profanation, and, uniting in a General Assembly of their own, proceeded with great promptitude to make equally emphatic deliverances on the opposite side of the same political question. But nice logical consistency and accurate working within the lines of a church theory were more than could reasonably be expected of a people in so pitiable a plight. The difference on the subject of the right function of the church continued to be held as the ground for continuing the separation from the General Assembly after the alleged ground in political geography had ceased to be valid. The working motive for it was more obvious in the unfraternal and most wantonly exasperating course of the National General Assembly during the war, but the best justification for it is to be found in the effective and useful working of the Southern Presbyterian Church. Considering the impoverishment and desolation of the Southern country, the record of useful and self-denying work accomplished by this body, not only at home but in foreign fields, from its beginning, an immensely honorable one. Another occasion of reconstruction was the strong disposition of the liberated negroes to withdraw themselves from the tutelage of the churches in which they had been held, in the days of slavery, in a lower caste relation. The eager entrance of the Northern churches upon mission work among the blacks, to which access had long been barred by atrocious laws and by the savage fury of mobs, tended to promote this change. The multiplication and growth of organized Negro denominations is a characteristic of the period after the war.
There is reason to hope that the change may by and by, with the advance of education and moral training among this people, inure to their spiritual advantage. There is equal reason to fear that at present in many cases it works to their serious detriment. The effect of the war was not exclusively divisive. In 2 instances at least it had the effect of healing old schisms. The Southern secession from the New School Presbyterian Church, which had come away in 1858 on the slavery issue, found itself in 1861 side by side with the Southern secession from the Old School, and in full agreement with its morals and politics. The two bodies were not long in finding that the doctrinal differences which a quarter century before had seemed so insuperable were, after all, no serious hindrance to their coming together. Even after the war was over, its healing power was felt, this time at the North. There was a honeycomb for Samson in the carcass of the monster. The two great Presbyterian sects at the North had found a common comfort in their relief from the perpetual festering irritation of the slavery question. They had softened toward each other in the glow of a religious patriotism. They had forgotten old antagonisms and common labors. And new issues had obscured the tenuous doctrinal disputes that had agitated the continent in 1837. Both parties grew tired and ashamed of the long and sometimes ill-natured quarrel. With such a disposition on both sides, terms of agreement could not fail in time to be found. For substance, the basis of reunion was this, that the New School Church should yield the point of organization, and the Old School Church should yield the point of doctrine. The New School men should sustain the Old School boards, and the Old School men should tolerate the New School heresies. The consolidation of the two sects into one powerful organization was consummated at Pittsburgh, November 12, 1869, with every demonstration of joy and devout thanksgiving. One important denomination, the Congregationalists, had had the distinguished advantage, through all these turbulent years, of having no Southern membership. Out of all proportion to its numerical strength was the part which it took in those missions to the neglected populations of the Southern country, into which the various denominations, both of the South and of the North, entered with generous emulation, while yet the war was still raging. Always leaders in advanced education, they not only, acting through the American Missionary Association, provided for primary and secondary schools for the negroes, but promoted the foundation of institutions of higher and even of the highest grade at Hampton, at Atlanta, at Tuskegee, at New Orleans, at Nashville, and at Washington. Many noble lives have been consecrated to this most Christ-like work of lifting up the depressed. No one will grudge a word of exceptional eulogy to the memory of that splendid character, General Samuel C. Armstrong, son of one of the early missionaries to the Sandwich Islands, who poured his inspiring soul into the building up of the Normal Institute at Hampton, Virginia, thus not only rearing a visible monument of his labor in the enduring buildings of that great and useful institution, but also establishing his memory, for as long as human gratitude can endure, in the hearts of hundreds of young men and young women, Negro and Indian, whose lives are better and nobler for having known him as their teacher. It cannot be justly claimed for the Congregationalists of the present day that they have lost nothing of that corporate unselfishness, seeking no sectarian aggrandizement, but only God's reign and righteousness, which had been the glory of their fathers. The studious efforts that have been made to cultivate among them a sectarian spirit, as if this were one of the Christian virtues, have not been fruitless. Nevertheless, it may be seen that their work of education at the South has been conducted in no narrow spirit. The extending of their sect over new territory has been a most trivial and unimportant result of their widespread and efficient work. A far greater result has been the promotion among the colored people of a better education, a higher standard of morality, and an enlightened piety, through the influence of the graduates of these institutions, not only as pastors and as teachers, but in all sorts of trades and professions and as mothers of families. This work of the Congregationalists is entitled to mention, not as exceptional, but only as eminent among like enterprises, in which few of the leading sects have failed to be represented. Extravagant expectations were at first entertained of immediate results in bringing the long depressed race up to the common plane of civilization, but it cannot be said that reasonable and intelligent expectations have been disappointed. Experience has taught much as to the best conduct of such missions. The gift of a fund of $1 million by the late John F. Slater of Norwich has, through wise management, conduced to this end. It has encouraged in the foremost institutions the combination of training to skilled productive labor with education in literature and science. The inauguration of these systems of religious education at the South was the most conspicuously important of the immediate sequels of the Civil War, but this time was a time of great expansion of the activities of the church in all directions. The influx of immigration, temporarily checked by the hard times of 1857 and by the 5 years of war, came in again in such floods as never before. The foreign immigration is always attended by a westward movement of the already settled population. The field of home missions became greater and more exacting than ever. The zeal of the church, educated during the war to higher ideas of self-sacrifice, rose to the occasion. The average yearly receipts of the various Protestant home missionary societies, which in the decade 1850 to 1859 had been $808,000, rose in the next decade to more than $2,000,000, in the next to nearly $3,000,000, and for the 7 years 1881 to 87 $4,000,000. In the perils of abounding wealth by which the church after the war was beset, it was divine fatherly kindness that opened before it new and enlarged facilities of service to the kingdom of heaven among foreign nations. From the first feeble beginnings of foreign missions from America and India and in the Sandwich Islands, they had been attended by the manifest favor of God. When the convulsion of the Civil War came on, with prostrations of business houses and enormous burdens of public obligation and private beneficence drawn down, as it seemed, to its bottom dollar for new calls of patriotism and charity, and especially when the dollar in a man's pocket shrank to half or third of its value in the world's currency, it seemed as if the work of foreign missions would have to be turned over to Christians in lands less burdened with accumulated disadvantages. But here again the grandeur of the burden gave an inspiration of strength to the burden bearer. From 1840 to 1849 the average yearly receipts of the various foreign missionary societies of the Protestant churches of the country had been a little more than $500,000. In the decade 1850 to 59 they had risen to $850,000. For the years of distress, 1860 to 69, they exceeded $1,300,000. For the 11 years 1870 to 1880 the annual receipts in this behalf were $2,200,000, and in the 7 years 1881 to 1887 they were $3,000,000. We have seen how, only 40 years before the return of peace, in the days of a humble equality and moderate estates, ardent souls exulted together in the inauguration of the era of democracy and beneficence, when every humblest giver might, through association and organization, have part in magnificent enterprises of Christian charity such as had theretofore been possible only to princes or to men of princely possessions. But with the return of civil peace we begin to recognize that among ourselves was growing up a class of men of princely possessions, a class such as the American Republic had never before known. Among those whose fortunes were reckoned by many millions or many tens of millions were men of sordid nature, whose wealth, ignobly won, was selfishly hoarded, and to whose names, as to that of the late Jay Gould, there is attached in the mind of the people a distinct note of infamy. But this was not in general the character of the American millionaire. There were those of nobler strain who felt a responsibility commensurate with the great power conferred by great riches, and held their wealth as in trust for mankind. Through the fidelity of men of this sort it has come to pass that the era of great fortunes in America has become conspicuous in the history of the whole world as the era of magnificent donations to benevolent ends. Within a few months of each other, from the little state of Connecticut, came the fund of $1,000,000 given by John F. Slater in his lifetime for the benefit of the freedom, the gift of a like sum for the like purpose from Daniel Hand, and the legacy of $1,500,000 for foreign missions from Deacon Otis of New London. Great gifts like these were frequently directed to objects which could not easily have been attained by the painful process of accumulating small donations. It was a period not only of splendid gifts to existing institutions, but of foundations for new universities, libraries, hospitals, and other institutions of the highest public service, foundations without parallel in human history for large munificence. To this period belong the beginnings of the Johns Hopkins University and Hospital at Baltimore, the University of Chicago, the Clark University at Worcester, the Vanderbilt University at Nashville, the Leland Stanford Jr. University of California, the Peabody and Enoch Pratt Libraries at Baltimore, the Lenox Library at New York, the great endowed libraries of Chicago, the Drexel Institute at Philadelphia, and the Armour Institute at Chicago. These are some of the names that most readily occur of foundations due mainly to individual liberality, set down at the risk of omitting others with equal claim for mention. Not all of these are to be referred to a religious spirit in the founders, but none of them can fail of a Christian influence and result. They prepare a foothold for such a forward stride of Christian civilization as our continent has never before known. The sum of these gifts of millions, added to the great aggregates of contribution to the national missionary boards and societies, falls far short of the total contributions expended in cities, towns, and villages for the building of churches and the maintenance of countless charities that cluster around them. The era following the war was preeminently a building era. Everyone knows that religious devotion is only one of the mingled motives that work together in such an enterprise as the building of a church. But, after all deductions, the voluntary gifts of Christian people for Christ's sake in the promotion of such works, when added to the grand totals already referred to, would make an amount that would overtax the ordinary imagination to conceive. And yet it is not certain that this period of immense gifts of money is really a period of increased liberality in the church from the time. 30 or 40 years before, when a millionaire was a rarity to be pointed out on the streets, and the possession of $100,000 gave one a place among the rich men of New York. In 1850, the total wealth of the United States was reported in the census as $7 billions. In 1870, after 20 years, it had more than fourfold, rising to 30 billions. 10 years later, according to the census, it had sixfold, rising to 43 billions. From the point of view of the one sitting over against the Treasury, it is not likely that any subsequent period has equaled in its gifts that early day when in New England the people were wont to build a fine church as soon as they had houses for themselves, and when the messengers went from cabin to gather the gifts of the college corn. End of chapter 20, part 1.
Chapter 20, Part 2 of A History of American Christianity by Leonard Woolsey Bacon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by K. Hand. Chapter 20, Part 2, After the War. The greatest addition to the forces of the Church in the period since the war has come from deploying into the field hitherto unused resources of personal service. The methods under which the personal activity of private Christians has formerly been organized for service have increased and multiplied, and old agencies have taken on new forms. The earliest, and to this day the most extensive of the organizations for utilizing the non-professional ministry in systematic religious labors is the Sunday School. The considerable development of this instrumentality begins to be recognized after the Second Awakening in the early years of the present century. The prevailing characteristic of the American Sunday School, as distinguished from its British congener, is that it is commonly a part of the equipment of the local church for the instruction of its own children, and incidentally one of the most important resources for its attractive work toward those that are without. But it is also recognized as one of the most flexible and adaptable arms of the service for aggressive work, whether in great cities or on the frontier. It was about the year 1825 that this work began to be organized on a national scale. But it is since the war that it has sprung into vastly greater efficiency. The agreement upon uniform courses of biblical study, to be followed simultaneously by many millions of pupils over the entire continent, has given a unity and coherence before unknown to the Sunday School system, and it has resulted in extraordinary enterprise and activity on the part of competent editors and publishers to provide apparatus for the thorough study of the text, which bids fair in time to take away the reproach of the term Sunday Schoolish, as applied to superficial, ignorant, or merely sentimental expositions of the Scriptures. The work of the Sunday School Times, in bringing within reach of teachers all over the land the fruits of the world's best scholarship, is a signal fact in history, the most conspicuous of a series of like facts. The tendency, slow of course, and partial, but powerful, is toward serious, faithful study and teaching, in which the mind of the Spirit is sought in the sacred text, with strenuous efforts of the teachable mind, with all the aids that can be brought from whatever quarter. The Sunday School system, coextensive with Protestant Christianity in America, and often the forerunner of church and ministry, and to a less extent under more scrupulous control of clergy, adopted into the Catholic Church, has become one of the distinctive features of American Christianity. An outgrowth of the Sunday School system, which under the conduct of a man of genius for organization, Dr. John H. Vincent, now a bishop of the Methodist Church, has expanded to magnificent dimensions, is that which is suggested by the name Chautauqua. Beginning in the summer of 1874 with a fortnight's meeting in a grove beside Chautauqua Lake for the study of the methods of Sunday School teaching, it led to the questions how to connect the Sunday School more intimately with other departments of the church and with other agencies in society, how to control in the interest of religious culture the forces, social, commercial, industrial, and educational, which, for good or evil, are affecting the Sunday School pupils every day of the week, striking root at other centers of assembly, east, west, and south, and combining its summer lectures with an organized system of home studies extending through the year, subject to written examinations, Chautauqua, by the comprehensive scope of its studies and by the great multitude of its students, is entitled to be called, in no ignoble sense of the word, a university. A weighty and unimpeachable testimony to the power and influence of the institution has been the recent organization of a Catholic Chautauqua under the conduct of leading scholars and ecclesiastics of the Roman Church. Another organization of the unpaid service of private Christians is the Young Men's Christian Association. Beginning in London in 1844, it had so far demonstrated its usefulness in 1851 as to attract favorable attention from visitors to the first of the world's fairs. In the end of that year the association in Boston was formed, and this was rapidly followed by others in the principal cities. It met a growing exigency in American society.
In the organization of commerce and manufacture in larger establishments than formerly, the apprenticeship system had necessarily lapsed, and nothing had taken its place. Of old, young men put to the learning of any business were articled or indentured as apprentices to the head of the concern, who was placed in loco parentis, being invested both with the authority and with the responsibility of a father. Often the apprentices were received into the house of the master as their home, and according to legend and romance it was in order for the industrious and virtuous apprentice to marry the old man's daughter and succeed to the business. After the employees of a store came to be numbered by scores and the employees of a factory by hundreds, the word apprentice became obsolete in the American language. The employee was only a hand, and there was danger that employers would forget that he was also a heart and a soul. This was the exigency that the Young Men's Christian Association came to supply. Men of conscience among employers and corporations recognized their opportunity and their duty. The new societies did not lack encouragement and financial aid from those to whom the character of the young men was not only a matter of Christian concern, but also a matter of business interest. In every considerable town the association organized itself, and the work of equipment and soon of building went on apace. In 1887 the association buildings in the United States and Canada were valued at $3.5 millions. In 1896 there were in North America 1,429 associations, with about 250,000 members, employing 1,251 paid officers, and holding buildings and other real estate to the amount of nearly $20 million. The work has not been without its vicissitudes. The wonderful revival of 1857, preeminently a layman's movement, in many instances found its nidus in the rooms of the associations, and their work was expanded and invigorated as a result of the revival. In 1861 came on the war. It broke up for the time the Continental Confederacy of Associations. Many of the local associations were dissolved by the enlistment of their members. But out of the inspiring exigencies of the time grew up in the heart of the associations the organization and work of the Christian Commission, cooperating with the Sanitary Commission for the bodily and spiritual comfort of the armies in the field. The two organizations expended upward of $11 millions, the free gift of the people at home. After the war, the survivors of those who had enlisted from the associations came back to their home duties, in most cases, better men for all good service in consequence of their experience of military discipline. A natural sequel to the organization and success of the Young Men's Christian Association is the institution of the Young Women's Christian Association, having like objects and methods in its proper sphere. This institution, too, owes the reason of its existence to changed social conditions. The plausible arguments of some earnest reformers in favor of opening careers of independent self-support to women, and the unquestionable and pathetic instances by which these arguments are enforced, are liable to some most serious and weighty offsets. Doubtless many a case of self-supporting young women, severed from home duties and influences, and out of business hours, under no effective restraints of rule. There is a rush from the country into the city of applicants for employment, and wages sink to less than a living rate. We are confronted with an artificial and perilous condition for the church to deal with, especially in the largest cities. And of the various instrumentalities to this end, the Young Women's Christian Association is one of the most effective. The development of organized activity among women has been a conspicuous characteristic of this period. From the beginning of our churches, the Charitable Sewing Circle, or Dorcas Society, has been known as a center both of prayer and of labor. But in this period the organization of women for charitable service has been on a continental scale. In 1874, in an outburst of zeal, women's crusades were undertaken, especially in some Western towns, in which bands of singing and praying women went in person to tippling houses and even worse resorts to assail them, visibly and audibly, with these spiritual weapons. The crusades, so long as they were a novelty, were not without result. Spectacular prayers, offered with one eye on the heavens and the other eye watching the impressions made on the human auditor, are not in vain. They have their reward. But the really important result of the Crusades was the organization of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which has extended in all directions to the utmost bounds of the country, and has accomplished work of undoubted value, while attempting other work the value of which is open to debate. The separate organization of women for the support and management of missions began on an extensive scale in 1868 with the Women's Board of Missions, instituted in alliance with the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions of the Congregationalist churches. The example at once commended itself to the imitation of all, so that all the principal mission boards of the Protestant churches are in alliance with actively working women's boards. The training acquired in these and other organizations by many women of exceptional taste and talent for the conduct of large affairs has tended still further to widen the field of their activity.
The ends of the earth, as well as the dark places nearer home, have felt the salutary results of it. In this brief and most incomplete sketch of the origin of one of the distinguishing features of contemporary Christianity, the application of the systematized activity of private Christians, no mention has been made of the corps of colporteurs or book peddlers employed by religious publication societies, nor of the vastly useful work of laymen employed as city missionaries, nor of the houses and orders of sisters wholly devoted to pious and charitable work. Such work, though the ceremony of ordination may have been omitted, is rather clerical or professional than laical. It is on this account the better suited to the genius of the Catholic Church, whose ages of experience in the conduct of such organizations, and whose fine examples of economy and efficiency in the use of them, have put all American Christendom under obligation. Among Protestant sects, the Lutherans, the Episcopalians, and the Methodists have, after the Moravians, showed themselves readiest to profit by the example. But a far more widely beneficent service than that of all the nursing orders together, both Catholic and Protestant, and one not less Christian, while it is characteristically American in its method, is that of the annually increasing army of faithful women professionally educated to the work of nursing, at 100 hospitals, and fulfilling their vocation individually and on business principles. The education of nurses is a sequel of the war and one of the beneficent fruits of it. Not the least important item in the organization of lay activity is the marvelously rapid growth of the Young People's Society for Christian Endeavor. In February, 1881, a pastor in Portland, Maine, the Reverend Francis E. Clark, organized into an association within his church a number of young people pledged to certain rules of regular attendance and participation in the association meetings and of cooperation in useful service. There seems to have been no particular originality of the plan, but through some felicity in arrangement and opportuneness in the time it caught like a forest fire, and in an amazingly short time ran through the country and around the world. One wise precaution was taken in the basis of the organization. It was provided that it should not interfere with any member's fidelity to his church or his sect, but rather promote it. Doubtless jealousy of its influence was thus in some measure forestalled and averted. But in the rapid spread of the society, those who were on guard for the interests of the several sects recognized a danger in too free affiliations outside of sectarian lines, and soon there were instituted in like forms of rule Epworth Leagues for Methodists, Westminster Leagues for Presbyterians, Luther Leagues for Lutherans, St. Andrew's Brotherhoods for Episcopalians, the Baptist Young People's Union, and yet others for yet other sects. According to the latest reports, the total pledged membership of this order of associated young disciples, in these various ramifications, is about 4,500,000. This is in the United States alone. Of the Christian Endeavor Society still adhering to the old name and constitution, there are in all the world 47,009, of which 11,119 are junior Endeavor Societies. The total membership is 2,820,540. Contemporary currents of theological thought, setting away from the excessive individualism which has characterized the churches of the Great Awakening, confirm the tendency of the Christian life toward a vigorous and even absorbing external activity. The duty of the church to human society is made a part of the required curriculum of study and preparation for the ministry, in fully equipped theological seminaries. If ever it has been a just reproach of the church that its frequenters were so absorbed in the saving of their own souls that they forgot the multitude about them, that reproach is fast passing away. The institutional church, as the clumsy phrase goes, cares for soul and body, for family and municipal and national life. Its saving sacraments are neither 2 nor 7, but 70 times 7. They include the bathtub as well as the font, the coffee house and the cook shop as well as the Holy Supper, the gymnasium as well as the prayer meeting. The college settlement plants colonies of the best life of the church in regions which men of little faith are tempted to speak of as God forsaken. The Salvation Army, with its noisy and eccentric ways, and its effective discipline, and its most Christian principle of setting every rescued man at work to aid in the rescue of others, is welcomed by all orders of the church and honored according to the measure of its usefulness, and even of its faithful effort to be useful. It is not to be supposed that this immense, unprecedented growth of outward activity can have been gained without some corresponding loss. The time is not long gone by when the sustained contemplation of the deep things of the cross, and the lofty things in the divine nature, and the subtle and elusive facts concerning the human constitution and character, and the working of the human will, were eminently characteristic of the religious life of the American Church. In the times when that life was stirred to its most strenuous activity, it was marked by the vicissitude of prolonged passions of painful sensibility at the consciousness of sin, and ecstasies of delight in the contemplation of the infinity of God and the glory of the Savior and his salvation. Everyone who is conversant with the religious biography of the generations before our own knows of the still hours and days set apart for the severe inward scrutiny of motives and frames and the grounds of one's hope. However truly the church of today may judge that the piety of their fathers was disproportioned and morbidly introspective and unduly concerned about one's own salvation, it is none the less true that the reaction from its excesses is violent and providing for itself a new reaction. The contemplative orders, whether among Catholics or Protestants, do not find the soil and climate of America congenial. And yet there is a mission field here for the mystic and the quietist, and when the stirabout activity of our generation suffers their calm voices to be heard, there are not a few to give ear. An event of great historical importance, which cannot be determined to a precise date, but which belongs more to this period than to any other, is the loss of the Scotch and Puritan Sabbath, or as many like to call it, the American Sabbath. The law of the Westminster Divines on this subject, it may be affirmed without fear of contradiction from any quarter, does not coincide in its language with the law of God as expressed in either the Old Testament or in the New. The Westminster rule requires, as if with a "Thus saith the Lord," that on the first day of the week, instead of the seventh, men shall desist not only from labor but from recreation, and spend the whole time in the public and private exercises of God's worship, except so much as is to be taken up in the works of necessity and mercy. This interpretation and expansion of the fourth commandment has never attained to more than a sectarian and provincial authority, but the overmastering Puritan influence, both of Virginia and of New England, combined with the Scotch-Irish influence, made it for a long time dominant in America. Even those who quite declined to admit the divine authority of the glosses upon the commandment felt constrained to submit to the ordinances of man for the Lord's sake. But it was inevitable that with the vast increase of travel and sojourn of American Christians in other lands of Christendom, and multitudinous immigration into America from other lands than Great Britain, the tradition from the Westminster elders should come to be openly disputed within the Church, and should be disregarded even when not denied. It was not only inevitable, it was a Christian duty distinctly enjoined by apostolic authority. The 5 years of war, during which Christians of various lands and creeds intermingled as never before, and the Sunday laws were dumb, inter arma, not only in the field but among the home churches, did perhaps even more to break the force of the tradition and to lead in a perilous and demoralizing reaction. Some reaction was inevitable. The church must needs suffer the evil consequence of overstraining the law of God. From the Sunday of ascetic self-denial, a day for a man to afflict his soul, there was a ready rush into utter recklessness of the law and privilege of rest. In the church there was wrought sore damage to weak consciences. Men acted, not from intelligent conviction, but from lack of conviction, and allowing themselves in self-indulgences of the rightfulness of which they were dubious, they condemned themselves in that which they allowed. The consequence in civil society was alike disastrous. Early legislation had not steered clear of the error of attempting to enforce Sabbath keeping as a religious duty by civil penalties, and some relics of that mistake remained, and still remain, on some of the statute books. The just protest against this wrong was, of course, undiscriminating, tending to defeat the righteous and most salutary laws that aim simply to secure for the citizen the privilege of a weekly day of rest, and to secure the holiday thus ordained by law from being perverted into a nuisance. The social change which is still in progress along these lines no wise Christian patriot can contemplate with complacency. It threatens, when complete, to deprive us of that universal quiet Sabbath rest which has been one of the glories of American social life, and an important element in its economic prosperity, and to give in place of it, to some, no assurance of a Sabbath rest at all, to others, a Sabbath of revelry and debauch. End of chapter 20, part 2. Chapter 21, Part 1 of A History of American Christianity by Leonard Woolsey Bacon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Chapter 31, Part 1, The Church in Theology and Literature. The rapid review of 3 crowded centuries, which is all that the narrowly prescribed limits of this volume have permitted, has necessarily been mainly restricted to external facts. But looking back over the course of visible events, it is not impossible for acute minds devoted to such study to trace the stream of thought and sentiment that is sometimes hidden from direct view by the overgrowth which itself has nourished. We have seen a profound spiritual change, renewing the face of the land and leaving its indelible impress on successive generations, springing from the profoundest contemplations of God and his work of salvation through Jesus Christ, and then bringing back into thoughtful and teachable minds new questions to be solved and new discoveries of truth to be pondered.
The one school of theological opinion and inquiry that can be described as characteristically American is the theology of the Great Awakening. The disciples of this school, in all its divergent branches, agree in looking back to the first Jonathan Edwards as the founder of it. Through its generations it has shown a striking sequence and continuity of intellectual and spiritual life, each generation answering questions put to it by its predecessor, while propounding new questions to the generation following. After the classical writings of its first founders, the most widely influential production of this school is the Theology Explained and Defended in a Series of Sermons of President Dwight. This had the advantage over some other systems of having been preached, and thus proved to be preachable. The series of sermons was that delivered to successive generations of college students at Yale at a time of prevailing skepticism, when every statement of the college pulpit was liable to sharp and not too friendly scrutiny, and it was preached with the fixed purpose of convincing and converting the young men who heard it. The audience, the occasion, and the man, a fervid Christian and a born poet and orator, combined to produce a work of wide and enduring influence. The dynasty of the Edwardians is continued down to the middle of the 19th century and later, through different lines, ending in Emmons of Franklin, Taylor of New Haven, and Finney of Oberlin, and is represented among the living by the venerable Edwards A. Park of Andover, who adds to that power of sustained speculative thinking in a straight line which is characteristic of the whole school, a wide learning in the whole field of theological literature, which had not been usual among his predecessors. It is a prevailing trait of this theology, born of the great revival, that it has constantly held before itself not only the question, what is truth, but also the question, how shall it be preached? It has never ceased to be a revival theology. A bold and open breach of traditionary assumptions and habits of reasoning was made by Horace Bushnell. This was a theologian of a different type from his New England predecessors. He was of a temper little disposed to accept either methods or results as local tradition, and inclined rather to prefer that which had been hammered out in his own anvil. And yet, while very free in manifesting his small respect for the logicking by syllogistic processes which had been the pride of the theological chair and even the pulpit in America, and while declining the use of current phraseologies even for the expression of current ideas, he held himself loyally subject to the canon of the Scriptures as his rule of faith, and deferential to the voice of the Church Catholic as uttered in the concord of testimony of holy men in all ages. Endowed with a poet's power of intuition, uplifted by a fervid piety, uttering himself in a literary style singularly rich and melodious, it is not strange that such a man should have made large contributions to the theological thought of his own and later times. In Natural Theology his discourses on The Moral Uses of Dark Things (1969), and his longest continuous work on Nature and the Supernatural (1858), even though read rather as prose poems than as arguments, sound distinctly new notes in the treatment of their theme. In God in Christ (1849), Christ in Theology (1851), The Vicarious Sacrifice (1866), and Forgiveness and Law (1847), and in a notable article in the New Englander for November 1854, entitled The Christian Trinity, a Practical Truth, the great topics of the Christian system were dealt with all the more effectively in the minds of thoughtful readers in this and other lands for cries of alarm and newspaper and pulpit impeachments of heresy that were sent forth. But that work of his which most nearly made as well as marked an epoch in American church history was the Treatise of Christian Nurture (1847). This, with the protracted controversy that followed upon the publication of it, was a powerful influence in lifting the American church out of the rut of mere individualism that had been wearing deeper and deeper from the days of the Great Awakening. Another wholesome and edifying debate was occasioned by the publications that went forth from the College and Theological Seminary of the German Reformed Church situated at Mercersburg in Pennsylvania. At this institution was effected a fruitful union of American and German theology. The result was to commend to the general attention aspects of truth, philosophical, theological, and historical, not previously current among American Protestants. The book of Dr. John Williamson Nevin, entitled The Mystical Presence, a Vindication of the Reformed or Calvinistic Doctrine of the Holy Eucharist, revealed to the vast multitude of churches and ministers that gloried in the name of Calvinist the fact that on the most distinctive article of Calvinism they were not Calvinists at all, but Zwinglians. The enunciation of the standard of doctrine of the various Presbyterian churches excited among themselves a clamor of heresy, and the doctrine of Calvin was put upon trial before the Calvinists. The outcome of a discussion that extended itself far beyond the boundaries of the comparatively small and uninfluential German Reformed Church was to elevate the point of view and broaden the horizon of American students of the constitution and history of the Church. Later generations of such students owe no light obligation to the fidelity and courage of Dr. Nevin, as well as to the erudition and immense productive diligence of his associate, Dr. Philip Schaff. It is incidental to the prevailing method of instruction in theology by a course of prelections in which the teacher reads to his class in detail his own original Summa Theologica, that the American press has been prolific of ponderous volumes of systematic divinity. Among the more notable of these systems are those of Leonard Woolsey, in 5 volumes, and of Enoch Pond, of the 2 Doctors Hodge, father and son, of Robert J. Breckinridge, and James H. Thornwell, and Robert L. Dabney, and the systematic theology of a much younger man, Dr. Augustus H. Strong of Rochester Seminary, which has won for itself very unusual and wide respect. Exceptional for ability as well as for its originality of conception is The Republic of God, an Institute of Theology, by Elisha Mulford, a disciple of Maurice and of the realist philosophy, the thought of whose whole life is contained in this and his kindred work on The Nation. How great is the debt which the church owes to its heretics is frequently illustrated in the progress of Christianity in America. If it had not been for the Unitarian defection in New England, and for the attacks from Germany upon the historicity of the Gospels, the theologians of America might to this day have been engrossed in "threshing old straw" in endless debates on the fixed fate, free will, foreknowledge absolute. The exigencies of controversy forced the study of the original documents of the Church. From his entrance upon his professorship at Andover in 1810, the eager enthusiasm of Moses Stuart made him the father of exegetical science, not only for America, but for all the English-speaking countries. His not less eminent pupil and associate, Edward Robinson, later of the Union Seminary, New York, created out of nothing the study of biblical geography. Associating with himself the most accomplished living Arabist, Eli Smith, of the American Mission at Beirut, he made those biblical researches in Palestine which have been the foundation on which all later explorers have built. Another American missionary, Dr. W. M. Thompson, has given the most valuable popular exposition of the same subject in his volumes on The Land and the Book. With the exception of Dr. Henry Clay Turnbull in his determination of the site of Kadesh Barnea, the American successors to Robinson in the original exploration of the Bible lands have made few additions to our knowledge. But in the department of biblical archaeology, the work of Drs. Ward, Peters, and Hilprecht in the mounds of Babylonia, and of Mr. Bliss in Palestine, has added not a little to the credit of the American Church against the heavy balance which we owe to the scholarship of Europe. Monumental works in lexicography have been produced by Dr. Thayer of Cambridge on New Testament Greek, by Professor Francis Brown of New York in conjunction with Canon Driver of Oxford on the languages of the Old Testament, and by Dr. Sophocles of Cambridge on the Byzantine Greek. In the work of the textual criticism of the Scriptures, notwithstanding its remoteness from the manuscript sources of study, America has furnished 2 names that are held in honor throughout the learned world. Among the recent dead, Ezra Abbott of Cambridge, universally beloved and lamented, and among the living, Caspar René Gregory, successor to the labors and the fame of Tischendorf. A 3rd name is that of the late Dr. Isaac H. Hall, the successful collator of Syriac New Testament manuscripts. In those studies of the higher criticism which at the present day are absorbing so much of the attention of biblical scholars, and the progress of which is watched with reasonable anxiety for their bearing on that dogma of the absolute inerrancy of the canonical Scriptures which has so commonly been postulated as the foundation of Protestant systems of revealed theology, the American Church has taken eager interest. In an eminent and in some respects the foremost place among the leaders in America of those investigations into the substructure, if not of the Christian faith, at least of the work of the system builders, is held by Professor W. H. Green of Princeton, whose painstaking essays in the higher criticism have done much to stimulate the studies of younger men who have come out at conclusions different from his own. The works of Professor Briggs of Union Seminary and Henry P. Smith of Lane Seminary have had the invaluable advantage of being commended to public attention by ecclesiastical processes and debates. The 2 volumes of Professor Bacon of Yale have been recognized by the foremost scholars of Great Britain and Germany as containing original contributions toward the solution of the problem of Pentateuchal analysis. The intricate critical questions presented by the Book of Judges have been handled with supreme ability by Professor Moore of Andover in his commentary on that book. A desideratum in biblical literature has been well supplied by Professor Bissell of Hartford in a work on the Old Testament Apocrypha. But the magnum opus of American biblical scholarship, associating with itself the best learning and ability of other nations, is the publication, under the direction of Professor Haupt of Baltimore, of a critical text of the entire Scriptures in the original languages, with new translations and notes, for the use of scholars. The undeniably grave theological difficulties occasioned by the results of critical study have given rise to a novel dogma concerning the Scriptures, which, if it may be justly claimed as a product of the Princeton Seminary, would seem to discredit the modest boast of the venerated Dr. Charles Hodge that Princeton has never originated a new idea. It consists in the hypothesis of an original autograph of the Scriptures, the precise contents of which are now undiscoverable, but which differed from any existing text in being absolutely free from error of any kind. The hypothesis has no small advantage in this, that if it is not susceptible of proof, it is equally secure from refutation. If not practically useful, it is at least novel, and on this ground entitled to mention in recounting the contributions of the American Church to theology at a really perilous point in the progress of biblical study. The field of church history, aside from local and sectarian histories, was late in being invaded by American theologians. For many generations, the theology of America was distinctly unhistorical, speculative, and provincial. But a change in this respect was inevitably sure to come. The strong propensity of the national mind toward historical studies is illustrated by the large proportion of historical works among the masterpieces of our literature, whether in prose or in verse. It would seem as if our conscious poverty in historical monuments and traditions had endangered an eager hunger for history. No travelers in ancient lands are such enthusiasts in seeking the monuments of remote ages as those whose homes are in regions not 2 generations removed from the prehistoric wilderness. It was certain that as soon as theology should begin to be taught to American students in its relation to the history of the kingdom of Christ, the charm of this method would be keenly felt. We may assume the date of 1853 as an epoch from which to date this new era of theological study. It was in that year that the gifted, learned, and inspiring teacher Henry Boynton Smith was transferred from the chair of history in Union Theological Seminary, New York, to the chair of systematic theology. Through his premature and most lamented death, the church has failed of receiving that system of doctrine which had been hoped for at his hands. But the historic spirit which characterized him has ever since been characteristic of that seminary. It is illustrative of the changed tone of theologizing that after the death of Professor Smith, in the reorganization of the faculty of that important institution, it was manned in the 3 chief departments, exegetical, dogmatic, and practical, by men whose eminent distinction was in the line of church history. The names of Hitchcock, Schaff, and Shedd cannot be mentioned without bringing to mind some of the most valuable gifts that America has made to the literature of the universal church. If to these we add the names of George Park Fisher of Yale and Bishop Hurst and Alexander V. G. Allen of Cambridge, author of The Continuity of Christian Thought, and Henry Charles Lee of Philadelphia, we have already vindicated for American scholarship a high place in this department of Christian literature. In practical theology, the productiveness of the American church in the matter of sermons has been so copious that even for the briefest mention some narrow rule of exclusion must be followed. There is no doubt that in a multitude of cases the noblest utterances of the American pulpit, being unwritten, have never come into literature, but have survived for a time as a glowing memory and then a fading tradition. The statement applies to many of the most famous revival preachers, and in consequence of a prevalent prejudice against the writing of sermons, it applies especially to the great Methodist and Baptist preachers, whose representation on the shelves of libraries is most disproportionate to their influence on the course of the kingdom of Christ. Of other sermons, and good sermons, printed and published, many have had an influence almost as restricted and as evanescent as the utterances of the pulpit improvisator. If we confine ourselves to these sermons that have survived their generation or won attention beyond the limits of local interest or of sectarian fellowship, the list will not be unmanageably long. In the early years of the 19th century, the Unitarian pulpits of Boston were adorned with every literary grace known to the rhetoric of that period. The luster of Channing's fame has outshone and outlasted that of his associates, and yet these were not stars of hardly less magnitude. The 2 Wares, father and son, the younger Buckminster, whose singular power as a preacher was known not only to wandering hearers, but to readers on both sides of the ocean, Gannett and Dewey, these were among them, and, in the next generation, Henry W. Bellows, Thomas Starr King, and James Freeman Clarke. No body of clergy of like size was ever so resplendent with talents and accomplishments. The names alone of those who left the Unitarian pulpit for a literary or political career, Sparks, Everett, Bancroft, Emerson, Ripley, Palfrey, Upham, among them, are a consolation by themselves. To the merely literary critics, those earnest preachers, such as Lyman and Edward Beecher, Griffin, Sereno Dwight, Wayland, and Kirk, who felt the call of God to withstand in Boston this splendid array of not less earnest men, were clearly inferior to their antagonists, but they were successful. A few years later, the preeminent American writer of sermons to be read and pondered in every part of the world was Horace Bushnell, as the great popular preacher whose words, caught burning from his lips, rolled around the world in a perpetual stream, was Henry Ward Beecher. widely different from either of those, and yet, in an honorable sense, successor to the fame of both, was Phillips Brooks, of all American preachers most widely beloved and honored in all parts of the church. Of living preachers whose sermons have already attained a place of honor in libraries at home and abroad, the name of Bishop F. D. Huntington stands among the foremost, and those who have been charmed by the brilliant rhetoric and instruction from the copious learning of his college classmate, Dr. Richard S. Storrs, must feel it a wrong done to our national literature that these gifts should be chiefly known to the reading public only by occasional discourses and by 2 valuable studies in religious history, instead of by volumes of sermons. Perhaps no American pulpits have to day a wider hearing beyond the sea than 2 that stand within hearing distance of each other on New Haven Green, occupied by Theodore T. Munger and Newman Smith. The pulpit of Plymouth Church, Brooklyn, has not ceased, since the accession of Lyman Abbott, to wield a wide and weighty influence, less wide, but in some respects more weighty, than in the days of his famous predecessor, by reason of a well-deserved reputation for biblical learning and insight, and for candor and wisdom in applying scriptural principles to the solution of current questions. The early American theology was, as we have seen, a rhetorical and not merely scholastic theology, a theology to be preached. In like manner, the American pulpit in those days was distinctly theological, like a professor's chair. One who studies with care the pulpit of today, in those volumes that seem to command the widest and most enduring attention, will find that it is to a large extent apologetic, addressing itself to the abating of doubts and objections to the Christian system, or, recognizing the existing doubts, urging the religious duties that are nevertheless incumbent on the doubting mind. It has ceased to assume the substantial soundness of the hearer in the main principles of orthodox opinion, and regards him as one to be held to the church by attraction, persuasion, or argument. The result of this attitude of the preacher is to make the pulpit studiously and even eagerly attractive and interesting. This virtue has its corresponding fault. The American preacher of today is in little danger of being dull; his peril lies at the other extreme. His temptation is rather to the feebleness of extravagant statement, and to an overstrained and theatric rhetoric such as some persons find so attractive in the discourses of Dr. Talmage, and others find repulsive and intolerable. A direction in which the literature of practical theology in America is sure to expand itself in the immediate future is indicated in the title of a recent work of that versatile and useful writer, Dr. Washington Gladden, Applied Christianity. The salutary conviction that political economy cannot be relied on by itself to adjust all the intricate relations of men under modern conditions of life, that the ethical questions that arise are not going to solve themselves automatically by the law of demand and supply, that the gospel and the church and the Spirit of Christ have somewhat to do in the matter, has been settling itself deeply into the minds of Christian believers. The impression that the questions between labor and capital, between sordid poverty and overgrown wealth, were old world questions of which we of the New World are relieved, is effectually dispelled. Thus far there is not much history to be written under this head, but somewhat of prophecy. It is now understood and felt in the conscience that these questions are for every Christian to consider, and for those undertaking the cure of souls to make the subject of their faithful, laborious professional study. The founding of professorships of social ethics and the theological seminaries must lead to important and speedy results in the efficiency of churches and pastors in dealing with this difficult class of problems. But whatever advances shall be made in the future, no small part of the impulse toward them will be recognized as coming from, or rather through, the inspiring and most Christian humanitarian writings and the personal influence and example of Edward Everett Hale. End of chapter 21, part 1.
Chapter 21, Part 2 of A History of American Christianity by Leonard Woolsey Bacon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Chapter 21, Part 2, The Church in Theology and Literature. In one noble department of religious literature, the liturgical, the record of the American church is meager. The reaction among the early colonists and many of the later settlers against forms of worship imposed by political authority was violent. Seeking for a logical basis, it planted itself on the assumption that no form, unless an improvised form, is permitted in public worship, except such as are sanctioned by express word of Scripture. In their sturdy resolution to throw off and break up the yoke, which neither they nor their fathers had been able to bear, of ordinances and traditions complicated with not a little of debilitating superstition, the extreme Puritans of England and Scotland rejected the whole system of holy days in the Christian year, including the authentic anniversaries of Passover and Pentecost, and discontinued the use of religious ceremonies at marriages and funerals. The only liturgical compositions that have come down to us from the first generations are the various attempts, in various degrees of harshness and rudeness, at the versification of psalms and other scriptures for singing.
The emancipation of the church from its bondage to an artificial dogma came, as we have already seen, with the Great Awakening and the introduction of Watts's Psalms of David, imitated in the language of the New Testament. After the Revolution, at the request of the General Association of Connecticut and the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, Timothy Dwight completed the work of Watts by versifying a few omitted psalms, and added a brief selection of hymns, chiefly in the grave and solemn scriptural style of Watts and Doddridge. Then followed in successive tides from England the copious hymnody of the Methodist revival, both Calvinist and Wesleyan, of the Evangelical revival, and now at last of the Oxford revival with its affluence of translations from the ancient hymnists as well as of original hymns. It is doubtless owing to this abundant intermittent inflow from England that the production of American hymns has been so scanty. Only a few writers, among them Thomas Hastings and Ray Palmer, have written each a considerable number of hymns that have taken root in the common use of the church. Not a few names besides are associated each with some one or two or three lyrics that have won an enduring place in the affections of Christian worshipers. The gospel hymns, which have flowed from many pens in increasing volume since the revival of 1857, have proved their great usefulness, especially in connections with the ministry of Messrs. Moody and Sankey, but they are, even the best of them, short-lived. After their season the church seems not unwilling to let them die. Soon after the midpoint of the 19th century began a serious study of the subject of the conduct of public worship, which continues to this day, with good promise of sometime reaching useful and stable results. In 1855 was published Eutaxia, or the Presbyterian Liturgies, Historical Sketches, by a minister of the Presbyterian Church. The author, Charles W. Baird, was a man peculiarly fitted to render the church important service, such as, indeed, he did render in this volume, and in the field of Huguenot history, which he divided with his brother Henry M. Baird. How great the loss to historical theology, through his protracted feebleness of body and his death, may be conjectured, not measured. This brief volume awakened an interest in the subject of it in America and in Scotland, and among the nonconformists of England. To American Presbyterians in general it was something like a surprise to be reminded that the sisterhood of the Reformed sects were committed by their earliest and best traditions in favor of liturgic uses in public worship. At about the same time the fruitful discussions of the Mercersburg controversy were in progress in the German Reformed Church. Mercersburg found fault with the common style of extemporaneous public prayer, and advocated a revival of the liturgical church service of the Reformation period, but so modified and reproduced as to be adapted to the existing wants of Protestant congregations. Each of these discussions was followed by a proposed book of worship. In 1857 was published by Mr. Baird a book of public prayer, compiled from the authorized formularies of worship of the Presbyterian Church, as prepared by the reformers Calvin, Knox, Bucer, and others. And in 1858 was set forth by a committee of the German Reformed Church a liturgy, or order of Christian worship. In 1855 St. Peter's Presbyterian Church of Rochester published its church book, prepared by Mr. L. W. Bacon, then acting as pastor, which was principally notable for introducing the use of the Psalms and parallelisms for responsive reading, a use which at once found acceptance in many churches and has become general in all parts of the country. Sporadic experiments followed in various individual congregations, looking toward greater variety or greater dignity or greater musical attractiveness in the services of public worship, or toward more active participation therein on the part of the people. But these experiments, conducted without concert or mutual counsel, often without serious study of the subject, and with a feebly aesthetic purpose, were representative of individual notions, and had in them no promise of stability or of fruit after their kind. Only by the increasing number of them they have given proof of an unrest on this subject which at last is beginning to embody itself in organization and concerted study and enterprise. A 50 years of mere tentative groping is likely to be followed by another 50 years of substantial progress. The influence of the Protestant Episcopal Church upon this growing tendency has been sometimes favorable, sometimes unfavorable, but always important. To begin with, it has held up before the whole church an example of prescribed forms for divine worship, on the whole, the best in all history. On the other hand, it has drawn to itself those in other sects whose tastes and tendencies would make them leaders in the study of liturgies, and thus, while enforcing itself, has hindered the general advance of improvement in the methods of worship. Withal, its influence has tended to narrow the discussion to the consideration of a single provincial and sectarian tradition, as if the usage of a part of the Christians of the southern end of one of the islands of the British archipelago had a sort of binding authority over the whole western continent.
But again, on the other hand, the broadening of its own views to the extent of developing distinctly diversive ways of thinking among its clergy and people has enlarged the field of study once more and tended to interest the church generally in the practical, historical, and theological aspects of the subject. The somewhat timid ventures of broad and evangelical men in one direction, and the fearless breaking of bounds in the other direction by those of ritualist sympathies, have done much to liberate this important communion from slavish uniformity and indolent traditionalism; and within a few years that has been accomplished which only a few years earlier would have been deemed impossible, the considerable alteration and improvement of the Book of Common Prayer. It is safe to prognosticate from the course of the history up to this point that the subject of the conduct of worship will become more and more seriously a subject of study in the American church in all its divisions; that the discussions thereon arising will be attended with strong antagonisms of sentiment; that mutual antagonisms within the several sects will be compensated by affiliations of men like-minded across sectarian lines; and that thus, as many times before, particular controversies will tend to general union and fellowship. One topic under this title of liturgics requires special mention: the use of music in the church. It was not till the early part of the 18th century that music began to be cultivated as an art in America. Up to that time the service of song in the house of the Lord had consisted in most worshiping assemblies on this continent in the singing of rude literal versifications of the Psalms and other scriptures to some 8 or 10 old tunes handed down by tradition, and variously sung in various congregations as modified by local practice. The coming in of singing by rule was nearly coincident with the introduction of Watts's Psalms and Hymns, and was attended with like agitations. The singing school for winter evenings became an almost universal social institution, and there actually grew up an American school of composition, quaint, rude, and ungrammatical, which had great vogue toward the end of the last century, and is even now remembered by some with admiration and regret. It was devoted mainly to psalmody tunes of an elaborate sort, in which the first half stanza would be sung in plain counterpoint, after which the voices would chase each other about in a lively imitative movement, coming out together triumphantly at the close. They abounded in forbidden progressions in empty chords, but were often characterized by fervor of feeling and by strong melodies. A few of them, as Lennox and Northfield, still linger in use, and the productions of this school in general, which amount to a considerable volume, are entitled to respectful remembrance as the first untutored utterance of music in America. The use of them became a passionate delight to our grandparents, and the traditions are fresh and vivid of the great choirs filling the church galleries on 3 sides and tossing the theme about from part to part. The use of these rudely artificial tunes involved a gravely important change in the course of public worship. In congregations that accepted them, the singing necessarily became an exclusive privilege of the choir. To a lamentable extent, where there was neither the irregular and spontaneous ejaculation of the Methodist, nor the rubrical response of the Episcopalian, the people came to be shut out from audible participation in the acts of public worship. A movement of musical reform in the direction of greater simplicity and dignity began early in this century, when Lowell Mason in Boston and Thomas Hastings in New York began their multitudinous publications of psalmody. Between them not less than 70 volumes of music were published in a period of half as many years. Their immense and successful fecundity was imitated with less success by others, until the land was swamped with an annual flood of church music books. A thin diluvial stratum remains to us from that time in tunes, chiefly from the pen of Dr. Mason, that have taken a permanent place as American chorals. Such pieces as Boylston, Hebron, Rockingham, Missionary Hymn, and the adaptations of the Gregorian melodies Olmutz and Hamburg, are not likely to be displaced from their hold on the American church by more skilled and exquisite compositions of later schools. But the fertile labors of the church musicians of this period were affected by the market demand for new materials for the singing school, the large church choir, and the musical convention. The music thus introduced into the churches consisted not so much of hymn tunes and anthems as of sacred glees. Before the middle of the century the Episcopal Church had arrived at a point at which it was much looked to set the fashions in such matters as church music and architecture. Its influence at this time was very bad. It was largely responsible for the fashion, still widely prevalent, of substituting for the church choir a quartet of professional solo singers, and for the degradation of church music into the dainty, languishing, and sensuous style which such artists do most affect. The period of the Grace Church collection, Greatorex's collection, and the sheet music compositions of George William Warren and John R. Thomas was the lowest tide of American church music. A healthy reaction from this vicious condition began about 1855 with the introduction of hymn and tune books and the revival of congregational singing.
From that time the progressive improvement of the public taste may be traced in the character of the books that have succeeded one another in the churches, until the admirable compositions of the modern English school of psalmody tend to predominate above those of inferior quality. It is the mark of a transitional period that both in church music and in church architecture we seem to depend much on compositions and designs derived from older countries. The future of religious art in America is sufficiently well assured to leave no cause for hurry or anxiety. In glancing back over this chapter, it will be strange if some are not impressed, and unfavorably impressed, with the disproportion in the names cited as representative, which are taken chiefly from some 2 or 3 sects. This may justly be referred to in part, no doubt, to the author's point of view and to the personal equation, but it is more largely due to the fact that in the specialization of the various sects, the work of the theological literature and science has been distinctively the lot of the Congregationalists and Presbyterians, and preeminently of the former. It is matter of congratulation that the inequality among the denominations in this respect is in a fair way to be outgrown. Special mention must be made of the peculiarly valuable contribution to the liturgical literature of America that is made by the oldest of our Episcopal churches, the Moravian. This venerable organization is rich not only in the possession of a heroic martyr history, but in the inheritance of liturgic forms and usages of unsurpassed beauty and dignity. Before the other churches had emerged from a half barbarous state in respect to church music, this art was successfully cultivated in the Moravian communities and missions. In past times these have had comparatively few points of contact and influence with the rest of the church, but when the elements of a common order of divine worship shall by and by begin to grow into form, it is hardly possible that the Moravian traditions will not enter into it as an important factor. A combination of conditions which in the case of other bodies in the church has been an effective discouragement to literary production has applied with especial force to the Roman Catholic Church in America. First, its energies and resources, great as they are, have been engrossed by absolutely prodigious burdens of practical labor, and secondly, its necessary literary material has been furnished to it from across the sea, ready to its hand or needing only the light labor of translation. But these 2 conditions are not enough of themselves to account for the very meager contribution of the Catholic Church to the common religious and theological literature of American Christendom. Neither is the fact explained by the general low average of culture among the Catholic populations, for literary production does not ordinarily proceed from a man of average culture, but from men of superior culture, such as this church possesses in no small number, and places in positions of undisturbed learned leisure that would seem in the highest degree promotive of intellectual work. But the comparative statistics of the Catholic and Protestant countries and universities of Germany seem to prove conclusively that the spirit and discipline of the Roman Catholic Church are unfavorable to literary productiveness in those larger fields of intellectual activity that are common and free alike to the scholars of all Christendom. It remains to be seen whether the stimulating atmosphere and the free and equal competitions of the New World will not show their invigorating effect in the larger activity of Catholic scholars, and their liberation from within the narrow lines of polemic and defensive literature. The Republic of Christian Letters has already shown itself prompt to welcome accessions from this quarter. The signs are favorable. Notwithstanding severe criticisms of their methods proceeding from the Catholic press, or rather in consequence of such criticisms, the Catholic institutions of higher learning are rising in character and in public respect, and the honorable enterprise of establishing at Washington an American Catholic University, upon the upbuilding of which shall be concentrated the entire intellectual strength and culture of this church, promises an invigorating influence that shall extend through that whole system of educational institutions which the church has set on foot at immense cost, and not with wholly satisfactory results. Recent events in the Catholic Church in America tend to reassure all minds on an important point on which not bigots and alarmists only, but liberal-minded citizens apostolically willing to look not only on their own things but also on the things of others, have found reasonable ground for anxiety. The American Catholic Church, while characterized in all its ranks, in respect of loyal devotion to the Pope, by a high type of ultramontane orthodoxy, is to be administered on patriotic American principles. The brief term of service of Monsignor Satolli as papal legate, clothed with plenipotentiary authority from the Roman See, stamped out the scheme called from its promoter Cahilism, which would have divided the American Catholic Church into permanent alien communities, conserving each its foreign language and organized under its separate hierarchy. The organization of parishes to be administered in other languages than English is suffered only as a temporary necessity. The deadly warfare against the American common school system has abated, and the anti-American denunciations contained in the bull and syllabus of December 8, 1864, are openly renounced as lacking the note of infallibility. Of course, as in all large communities of vigorous vitality, there will be mutually antagonist parties in this body. But it is hardly to be doubted that with the growth and acclimatization of the Catholic Church in America, that party will eventually predominate which is most in sympathy with the ruling ideas of the country and the age. End of chapter 21, part 2.
Chapter 22, Part 1 of A History of American Christianity by Leonard Woolsey Bacon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Chapter 22, Part 1, Tendencies Toward a Manifestation of the Unity of the American Church. The 3 centuries of history which we have passed under rapid review comprise a series of political events of the highest importance to mankind. We have seen, from our side point of view, the planting, along the western coast of the Atlantic Ocean, without mutual concert or common direction, of many independent germs of civilization. So many of these as survived the perils of infancy, we have seen growing to a lusty youth, and becoming drawn to each other by ties of common interest and mutual fellowship. Releasing themselves from colonial dependence on a transatlantic power, we find these several communities, now grown to be states, becoming conscious, through common perils, victories, and hopes, of national unity in life, and ordaining institutes of national government binding upon all. The strong vitality of the new nation is proved by its assimilation to itself an immense mass of immigrants from all parts of Europe, and by expanding itself without essential change over the area of a continent. It triumphs again and again, and at last in a struggle that shakes the world, over passions and interests that threaten schism in the body politic, and gives good reason to its friends to boast the solid unity of the Republic as the strongest existing fact in the political world. The very great aggrandizement of the nation has been an affair of the last 60 years, but already it has recorded itself throughout the vast expanse of the continent in monuments of architecture and engineering worthy of the national strength. The ecclesiastical history which has been recounted in this volume, covering the same territory and the same period of time, runs with equal pace in many respects parallel with the political history, but in one important respect with a wide divergence. As with civilization, so with Christianity, the germs of it, derived from different regions of Christendom, were planted without concert of purpose, and often with distinct cross purposes, in different seed plots along the Atlantic seaboard. Varying in polity, in forms of dogmatic statement, and even in language, the diverse growths were made, through wonders of spiritual influence and through external stress of trial, to feel their unity in the one faith. The course of a common experience tended to establish a predominant type of religious life, the influence of which has been everywhere felt, even when it has not been consented to. The vital strength of the American Church, as of the American nation, has been subjected to the test of the importation of enormous masses of more or less uncongenial population, and has shown an amazing power of digestion and assimilation. Its resources have been taxed by the providential imposition of burdens of duty and responsibility such, in magnitude and weight, as never since the early preaching of the gospel have pressed upon any single generation of the Church. Within the space of a single lifetime, at an expenditure of toil and treasure which it is idle to attempt to compute, the wide and desolate wilderness, as far as civilization has invaded it, has been occupied by the Church with churches, schools, colleges, and seminaries of theology, with pastors, evangelists, and teachers, and in one way or another has been constrained to confess itself Christian. The continent, which so short a time ago had been compassionately looked upon from across the sea as missionary ground, has become a principal base of supplies, and a recruiting ground for men and women for missionary operations in ancient lands of heathenism and of a decayed Christianity. So much for the parallel. The divergence is not less impressive. In contrast with the solid political unity into which the various and incongruous elements have settled themselves, the unity of the Christian Church is manifested by oneness neither of jurisdiction, nor of confederation, nor even by diplomatic recognition and correspondence. Out of the total population of the United States, amounting, according to the census of 1890, to 62,622,000 souls, the 57,000,000 accounted as Christians, including 20,000,000 communicant church members, are gathered into 165,297 congregations, assembling in 142,000 church edifices containing 43,000,000 sittings, and valued, together with other church property, at $670,000,000. And are served in the ministry of the gospel by more than 111,000 ministers. But this great force is divided among 143 mutual independent sects, larger and smaller. Among these sects is recognized no controlling and no coordinating authority, neither is there any common leadership.
Neither is there any system of mutual counsel and concert. The mutual relations of the sects are sometimes those of respect and goodwill, sometimes of sharp competition and jealousy, sometimes of eager and conscientious hostility. All have one and the same unselfish and religious aim, to honor God in serving their fellow men, and each one in honestly seeking this supreme aim is affected by corporate interests, sympathies, and antipathies. This situation is too characteristic of America and too distinctly connected with the whole course of the antecedent history not to be brought out with emphasis in this concluding chapter. In other lands the church is maintained, through the power of the civil government, under the exclusive control of a single organization, in which the element of popular influence may be wholly wanting, or may be present, as in many of the reformed polities, in no small measure. In others yet, through government influence and favor, a strong predominance is given to one organized communion, under the shadow of which dissident minorities are tolerated and protected. Under the absolute freedom and equality of the American system there is not so much as a predominance of any one of the sects. No one of them is strong and numerous, but that it is outnumbered and outweighed by the aggregate of the two next to it. At present, in consequence of the rush of immigration, the Roman Catholic Church is largely in advance of any single denomination besides, but it is inferior in numerical strength and popular influence to the Methodists and Baptists combined, if they were combined. And there is no doubt that this comminution of the Church is frankly accepted, for reasons assigned, not only as an inevitable drawback to the blessings of religious freedom, but as a good thing in itself. A weighty sentence of James Madison undoubtedly expresses the prevailing sentiment among Americans who contemplate the subject merely from the political side. In a free government, the security for civil rights must be the same as that for religious rights. It consists in the one case in the multiplicity of interests, and in the other in the multiplicity of sects. The degree of security in both cases will depend on the number of interests and sects. And no student of history can deny that there is much to justify the jealousy with which the lovers of civil liberty watch the climbing of any sect, no matter how purely spiritual its constitution, toward a position of command and popular influence. The influence of the leaders of such a sect may be nothing more than the legitimate and well-deserved influence of men of superior wisdom and virtue, but when reinforced by the weight of official religious character and backed by a majority, or even a formidable minority, of voters organized in a religious communion, the feeling is sure to gain ground that such power is too great to be trusted to the hands of even the best of men. Whatever sectarian advantage such a body may achieve in the state by preponderance of number will be more than offset by the public suspicion and the watchful jealousy of rival sects, and the weakening of it by division, or the subordination of it by the overgrowth of a rival, is sure to be regarded with general complacency. It is not altogether a pleasing object of contemplation, the citizen and the statesman looking with contentment on the schism of the church as averting a danger to the state. It is hardly more gratifying when we find ministers of the church themselves accepting the condition of the schism as being, on the whole, a very good condition for the Church of Christ, if not indeed the best possible. It is quite unreservedly argued that the principle, competition is the life of business, is applicable to spiritual as well as secular concerns, and the emulations reprobated by the Apostle Paul as works of the flesh are frankly appealed to for promoting the works of the Spirit. This debasing of the motive of church work is naturally attended by a debasement of the means employed. The competitive church resorts to strange business devices to secure its needed revenue. He that giveth is induced to give, not with simplicity, but with a view to incidental advantages, and a distinct understanding is maintained between the right hand and the left. The extent and variety of this influence on church life in America afford no occasion for pride, but the mention of them could not rightly be omitted. It remains for the future to decide whether they must needs continue as an inevitable attendant on the voluntary system. Sectarian divisions tend strongly to perpetuate themselves. The starting of schism is easy and quick; the healing of it is a matter of long diplomatic negotiations. In a very short time the division of the church, with its necessary relations to property and to the employment of officials, becomes a vested interest. Provision for large expenditure unnecessary or even detrimental to the general interests of the kingdom of Christ, which had been instituted in the first place at heavy cost to the many, is not to be discontinued without more serious loss to influential individuals. Those who would set themselves about the healing of a schism must reckon upon personal and property interests to be conciliated. This least amiable characteristic of the growth of the Christian church in America is not without its compensations. The very fact of the existence, in the presence of one another, of these multitudinous rival sects, all equal before the law, tends in the long run, under the influence of the Holy Spirit of peace, to a large and comprehensive fellowship. The widely prevalent acceptance of existing conditions as probably permanent, even if not quite normal, softens the mutual reproaches of rival parties. The presumption is of course implied, if not inserted, in the existence of any Christian sect, that it is holding the absolute right and truth, or at least more nearly that than the other sects. And the inference to a religious mind is that the right and the true must in the long run prevail. But it is only with a high act of faith, and not as a matter of reasonable probability, that any sect in America can venture to indulge itself in the expectation of a supremacy or even a predominance in American Christendom. The strongest in numbers, in influence, in prestige, however tempted to assert for itself exclusive or superior rights, is compelled to look about itself and find itself overwhelmingly outnumbered and outdone by a divided communion, and yet a communion, of those whom Christ is not ashamed to call his brethren. And just in proportion as it has the Spirit of Christ, it is constrained in its heart to treat them as brethren and to feel toward them as brethren. Its protest against what it regards as their errors and defects is nowise weakened by the most unreserved manifestations of respect and goodwill as toward fellow Christians. Thus it comes to pass that the observant traveler from other countries, seeking the distinctive traits of American social life, notes a kindlier feeling between all denominations, Roman Catholics included, a greater readiness to work together for common charitable aims, than between Catholics and Protestants in France or Germany, or between Anglicans and Nonconformists in England. There are many indications in the recent history of the American Church pointing forward toward some higher manifestation of the true unity of the Church than is to be found in occasional or even habitual expressions of mutual goodwill passing to and fro among sharply competing and often antagonist sects. Instead of easygoing and playful felicitations on the multitude of sects as contributing to the total effectiveness of the Church, such as used to be common enough on anniversary platforms, we hear, in one form and another, the acknowledgment that the divided and subdivided state of American Christendom is not right but wrong. Whose is the wrong need not be decided. Certainly it does not wholly belong to the men of this generation or of this country. We are heirs of the schisms of other lands and ages, and have added to them schisms of our own making. The matter begins to be taken soberly and seriously. The tender entreaty of the Apostle Paul not to suffer ourselves to be split up into sects begins to get a hearing in this conscience. The nisus toward a more manifest union among Christian believers has long been growing more and more distinctly visible, and is at the present day one of the most conspicuous signs of the times. Already in the early history we have observed a tendency toward the healing in America of differences imported from over the sea. Such was the commingling of Separatist and Puritan in New England, the temporary alliance of the Congregationalist and Presbyterian to avert the imposition of a state hierarchy, the combination of Quaker and Roman Catholic to defeat a project of religious oppression in Maryland, the drawing together of Lutheran and Reformed Germans for common worship under the saintly influence of the Moravian Zinzendorf, and the plan of the Union by which New Englander and Scotch Irishmen were to labor in common for the evangelization of the new settlements. These were sporadic instances of a tendency that was by and by to become happily epidemic. A more important instance of the same tendency was the organization of societies for charitable work which should unite the gifts and personal labors of the Christians of the whole continent. The chief period of these organizations extended from 1810, the date of the beginning of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, to 1826, when the American Home Missionary Society was founded. The Catholic basis on which they were established was dictated partly by the conscious weakness of the several sects as they drew near to undertakings formidable even to their united forces, and partly by the glow of fraternal affection and the sense of a common spiritual life pervading the nation, with which the Church had come forth from the fervors of the Second Awakening. The societies, representing the common faith and charity of the whole Church as distinguished from the peculiarities of the several sects, drew to themselves the affection and devotion of Christian hearts to a degree which, to those who highly valued these distinctions, seemed to endanger important interests. And indeed the situation was anomalous, in which the sectarian divisions of the Christian people were represented in the churches, and their Catholic unity in charitable societies. It would have seemed more Pauline, not to say more Christian, to have had voluntary societies for the sectarian work, and kept the churches for Christian communion. It is no wonder that high church champions, on one side and another, soon began to shout to their adherents, "To your tents, O Israel!" Bishop Hobart played not in vain upon his pastoral pipe to whistle back his sheep from straying outside of his pinfold, exhorting him, in their endeavors for the general advancement of religion, to use only the instrumentality of their own church. And a jealousy of the growing influence of a wide fellowship in charitable labors with Christians of other names led to the enunciation of a like doctrine by High Church Presbyterians, and contributed to the convulsive and passionate rending of the Presbyterian Church in 1837 into nearly equal fragments. So effective has been the centrifugal force that of the extensive system of societies which from the year 1810 onward first organized works of national beneficence by enlisting the cooperation of all evangelical Christians, the American Bible Society alone continues to represent any general and important combination from among the different denominations. For all the waning of interest in the Catholic basis societies, the sacred discontent of the Christian people with sectarian division continued to demand expression. How early the aspiration for an ecumenical council of evangelical Christendom became articulate, that it may not be easy to discover. In the year 1846 the aspiration was in some measure realized in the first meeting of the Evangelical Alliance at London. No more mistakes were made in this meeting than perhaps were necessarily incident to a first experiment in untried work. Almost of course the good people began with the question, what good men shall we keep out? For it is a curious fact, in the long and interesting history of the efforts after Christian union, that they commonly take the form of efforts so to combine many Christians as to exclude certain others. In this instance, beginning with the plan of including none but Protestant Christians, they proceeded at once to frame a platform that should bar out that great number of the best and holiest men in England who are found among the Quakers, thus making up, designedly and with their eyes open, a schismatic unity, a unity composed of one part of God's elect to the exclusion of another, and this in a grand effort after the very unity of the body of Christ. But in spite of this and other like mistakes, or rather because of them, for it is through its mistakes that the church is to learn the right way, the early and unsuccessful beginnings of the Evangelical Alliance marked a stage in the slow progress toward a manifestation of the sons of God by their love toward each other and toward the common Lord. It is in large part the eager appetency for some manifestation of interconfessional fellowship that has hastened the acceptance of such organizations as the Young Men's Christian Association and the Young People's Society of Christian Endeavor, just as, on the other hand, it is the conscientious fear, on the part of watchful guardians of sectarian interests, that habitual fellowship across the boundary lines of denominations may weaken the allegiance to the sect, which has induced the many attempts at substituting associations constituted on a narrower basis. But the form of organization which most comprehensively illustrates the unity of the church, that is that charity organization which has grown to be a necessity to the social life of cities and considerable towns, furnishing a central office of mutual correspondence and coordination to all churches and societies and persons engaged in the Christian work of relieving poverty and distress. This Central Bureau of Charitable Cooperation is not the less a center of Catholic fellowship for the fact that it does not shut its door against societies not distinctively Christian, like Masonic fraternities, or even against societies distinctively non-Christian, like Hebrew synagogues and societies of ethical culture. We are coming to discover that the essence of Christian fellowship does not consist in keeping people out. Neither, so long as the apostolic rubric of Christian worship remains unaltered, is it to be denied that the fellowship thus provided for is a fellowship in one of the sacraments of Christian service. A notable advance in the true Catholicity of communion is reported from among the churches and scattered missions in Maine. Hitherto in the various movements of Christian union it was common to attempt to disarm the suspicions of zealous sectarians by urgent disclaimers of any intent or tendency to infringe on the rights or interests of the several sects, or impair their claim to a paramount allegiance from their adherents. The Christians of Maine, facing tasks of evangelization more than sufficient to occupy all their resources, even when well economized and squandering nothing on needless divisions and competitions, have attained to the high grace of saying that sectarian interests must and shall be sacrificed when the paramount interests of the kingdom of Christ require it. When this attainment is reached by other souls and many other, the conspicuous shame and scandal of American Christianity will begin to be abated. End of chapter 22, part 1. Chapter 22, Part 2 of A History of American Christianity by Leonard Woolsey Bacon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Chapter 22, Part 2, Tendencies Toward a Manifestation of the Unity of the American Church. Meanwhile, the signs of a craving for larger fellowship continue to be multiplied. Quite independently of practical results achieved, the mere fact of efforts and experiments is a hopeful fact, even when these are made in directions in which the past experience of the church has written up no thoroughfare. 1. No one need question the sincerity or the fraternal spirit with which some important denominations have proposed the reuniting of Christians on the simple condition that all others should accept the distinctive tenet for which each of these denominations has contended against others. The present pope, holding the personal respect and confidence of the Christian world to a higher degree than any one of his predecessors since the Reformation, to name no earlier date, has earnestly besought the return of all believers to a common fellowship by their acceptance of the authority and supremacy of the Roman See. With equal cordiality, the bishops of the Protestant Episcopal Church have signified their longing for restored fellowship with their brethren on the acceptance by these of prelatical episcopacy. And the Baptists, whose constant readiness at fraternization in everything else is emphasized by their conscientious refraining from the sacramental sign of communion, are not less earnest in their desire for the unification of Christendom by the general acceptance of that tenet concerning baptism, the widespread rejection of which debars them, reluctant, from unrestricted fellowship with the general company of faithful men. But while we welcome every such manifestation of a longing for union among Christians, and honor the aspiration that it might be brought about in one or another of these ways, in forecasting the probabilities of the case, we recognize the extreme unlikeliness that the very formulas which for ages have been the occasion of mutual contention and separation shall become the basis of general agreement and lasting concord. 2. Another indication of the craving for a larger fellowship is found in the efforts made for large sectarian councils, representing closely kindred denominations in more than one country. The imposing ubiquity of the Roman Church, so impressively sustaining its claim to the title Catholic, may have had some influence to provoke other denominations to show what could be done in emulation of this sort of greatness. It were wiser not to invite comparison at this point. No other Christian organization, or close fellowship of organizations, can approach that which has its seat at Rome, in the world wideness of its presence, or demand with so bold a challenge, Quae regio in terris non nostri plena laboris. The representative assembly of any other body of Christians, however widely ramified, must seem insignificant when contrasted with the real ecumenicity of the Vatican Council. But it has not been useless for the larger sects of Protestantism to arrange their international assemblies, if it were for nothing more than this, that such widening of the circle of practical fellowship may have the effect to disclose to each sect a larger Christendom outside to which their fellowship must sooner or later be made to reach. The first of these international sectarian councils was that commonly spoken of as the Pan-Anglican Synod of Presbyterian Episcopal bishops gathered at Lambeth by invitation of the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1867, and thrice since. The example was bettered by the Presbyterians, who in 1876 organized for permanence their Pan-Presbyterian Alliance, or Alliance of the Reformed Churches throughout the world holding the Presbyterian system. The first of the triennial general councils of this alliance was held at Edinburgh in 1877, representing more than 49 separate churches scattered through 25 different countries and consisting of more than 20,000 congregations. The second council was held at Philadelphia, and the third at Belfast. The idea was promptly seized by the Methodists. At the instance of the General Conference of the United States, a Pan-Methodist Council was held in London in 1881, the first ecumenical Methodist conference, consisting of 400 delegates representing 28 branches of Methodism, 10 in the Eastern Hemisphere and 18 in the Western, including 6 millions of communicants and about 20 millions of people. 10 years later, in 1891, a second Methodist Ecumenical Conference was held at Washington. Interesting and useful as this international organization of sects is capable of being made, it would be a mistake to look upon it as marking a stage in the progress toward a manifest general unity of the Church. The tendency of it is, on the whole, in the opposite direction. 3. If the organization of ecumenical sects has little tendency toward the visible communion of saints in the American Church, not much more is to be hoped from measures for partial consolidation of sects, such as are often projected and sometimes realized. The healing of the great 30-year schism of the Presbyterian Church in 1869 was so vast a gain in ecclesiastical economy, and in the abatement of a long-reeking public scandal and of a multitude of local frictions and irritations, that none need wonder at the awakening of ardent desires that the 10 Presbyterian bodies still surviving might find room for all within one fold in a national or continental Presbyterian Church. The 17 Methodist bodies, separated by no differences of polity or of doctrine that seem important to anybody but themselves, if consolidated into one, would constitute a truly imposing body, numbering nearly 5 millions of communicants and more than 15 millions of people. And if this should absorb the Protestant Episcopal Church, an event the possibility of which has often been contemplated with complacency, with its 500,000 of communicants and its elements of influence far beyond the proportion of its numbers, the result would be an approximation to some good men's ideal of a national church, with its army of ministers coordinated by a college of bishops, and its plebes adunata sacerdoti. Consultations are even now in progress looking toward the closer fellowship of the Congregationalists and the Disciples. The easy and elastic terms of internal association in each of these denominations make it the less difficult to adjust terms of mutual cooperation and union. Suppose that the various Baptist organizations were to discover that under their like reprobate in the manner of baptism they could, for certain defined purposes, enter into the same combination, the result would be a body of nearly 5 millions of communicants, not the less strong for being lightly harnessed and for comprehending wide diversities of opinion and temperament. In all this we have supposed to be realized nothing more than the friends of Christian union have at one time or another urged as practicable and desirable. By these few and, it would seem, not incongruous combinations, there would be 4 powerful ecclesiastical corporations, 1 Catholic and 3 Protestant, which, out of the 20 millions of church communicants in the United States, would include more than 17½ millions.
The pondering of these possibilities is pertinent to this closing chapter on account of the fact that, as we near the end of the 19th century, one of the most distinctly visible tendencies is the tendency toward the abatement of sectarian division in the Church. It is not for us simply to note the converging lines of tendency without some attempt to compute the point toward which they converge. There is grave reason to doubt whether this line of the consolidation or confederation of sects, followed never so far, would reach the desired result. If the 143 sects enumerated in the 11th census of the United States should by successful negotiation be reduced to 4, distinguished each from the others by strongly marked diversities of organization and of theological statement, and united to each other only by community of the one faith in Jesus Christ, doubtless it would involve some important gains. It would make it possible to be rid of the friction and sometimes the clash of much useless and expensive machinery, and to extinguish many local schisms that had been engendered by the zeal of some central sectarian propaganda. Would it tend to mitigate the intensity of sectarian competition, or would it tend rather to aggravate it? Is one's pride in his sect, his zeal for the propagation of it, his jealousy of any influence that tends to impair its greatness or hinder its progress, likely to be reduced, or is it rather likely to be exalted by the consciousness that the sect is a very great sect, standing alone for important principles? Whatever there is at present of asperity in the emulous labors of the competing denominations, would it not be manifold exasperated if the competition were restricted to 4 great corporations or confederations? If the intestine conflict of the Church of Christ in America should even be narrowed down, as many have devoutly wished, to 2 contestants, the Catholic Church with its diversity of orders and rites on the one hand, and Protestantism with its various denominations solidly confederated on the other, should we be nearer to the longed-for achievement of Christian union? Or should we find sectarian animosities thereby raised to the highest power, and the Church, discovering that it was on the wrong track for the desired terminus, compelled to reverse and back in order to be switched upon the right one? Questions like these, put to be considered, not to be answered, raise in the mind the misgiving that we have been seeking in diplomatic negotiations between high contracting parties that which diplomacy can do only a little toward accomplishing. The great aim is to be sought in humbler ways. It is more hopeful to begin at the lower end. Not in great towns and centers of ecclesiastical influence, but in villages and country districts, the deadly effects of comminuted fracture in the Church are most deeply felt. It is directly to the people of such communities, not through the medium of persons or committees that represent national sectarian interests, that the new commandment is to be preached, which yet is no new commandment, but the old commandment which they have had from the beginning. It cannot always be that sincere Christian believers, living together in a neighborhood in which the ruinous effects of division are plain to every eye, shall continue to misapprehend or disregard some of the tenderest and most unmistakable counsels of their Lord and his apostles, or imagine the authority of them to be canceled by the authority of any sect or party of Christians. The double fallacy, first, that it is a Christian's prime duty to look out for his own soul, and secondly, that the soul's best health is to be secured by sequestering it from contact with dissident opinions, and indulging its tastes and preferences wherein they differ from those of its neighbor, must sometimes be found out and exposed. The discovery will be made that there is nothing in the most cherished sermons and sacraments and prayers that is comparable in value, as a means of grace, with the giving up of all these for God's reign and righteousness, that he who will save his soul shall lose it, and he who will lose his soul for Christ and his gospel shall save it to life eternal. These centuries of church history, beginning with convulsive disruptions of the church in Europe, with persecutions and religious wars, present before us the importation into the New World of the religious divisions and subdivisions of the Old, and the further division of these beyond any precedent in history. It begins to look as if in this strange work God had been grinding up material for a nobler manifestation of the unity of his people. The sky of the declining century is red with promise. Hitherto, not the decay of religious earnestness only, but the revival of it, has brought into the church not peace, but division. When next some divine breathing of spiritual influence shall be wafted over the land, can any man forbid the hope that from village to village the members of disintegrated and enfeebled Church of Christ may be gathered together, with one accord, in one place, not for the transient fervors of the revival only, but for permanent fellowship in work and worship? A few examples of this would spread their influence throughout the American church until the whole was leavened.
The record of important events in the annals of American Christianity may well end with that wholly unprecedented gathering at Chicago in connection with the magnificent celebration of the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America by Columbus. I mean, of course, the Parliament of Religions. In a land which bears among the nations the reproach of being wholly absorbed in devotion to material interests, and in which the church, unsupported and barely recognized by the state, and unregulated by any secular authority, scatters itself into what seems to be hopelessly discordant fragments, a bold enterprise was undertaken in the name of American Christianity, such as the church in no other land of Christendom would have had the power or the courage to venture on. With large hospitality, representatives of all the religions of the world were invited to visit Chicago free of cost as guests of the Parliament. For 17 days the Christianity of America and of Christendom and of Christian missions in heathen lands sat confronted, no, not confronted, but side by side on the same platform with the non-Christian religions represented by their priests, prelates, and teachers. Of all the diversities of Christian opinion and organization in America, nothing important was unrepresented, from the authoritative dogmatic system and the solid organization of the Catholic Church, present in the person of its highest official dignitaries, to the broadest liberalism and the most unrestrained individualism. There were those who stood aloof and prophesied that nothing could come of such an assemblage but a hopeless jangle of discordant opinions. The forebodings were disappointed. The diverse opinions were there, and were uttered with entire unreserve. But the jangle of discord was not there. It was seen and felt that the American church, in the presence of the unchristian and anti-Christian powers, and in presence of those solemn questions of the needs of humanity that overtask the ingenuity and the resources of us all combined, was builded as a city that is at unity with itself. That body which, by its strength of organization, and by the binding force of its antecedents, might have seemed to some most hopelessly isolated from the common sympathies of that assembly, like all the rest was faithful in assertion of its claims, and, on the other hand, was surpassed by none in the manifestation of fraternal respect toward fellow Christians of other folds. Since those 17 wonderful September days of 1893, the idea that has so long prevailed with multitudes of minds, that the only Christian union to be hoped for in America must be a union to the exclusion of the Roman Catholic Church and in antagonism to it, ought to be reckoned an idea obsolete and antiquated. The theme prescribed for this volume gives no opportunity for such a conclusion as the literary artist delights in, a climax of achievement and consummation, or the catastrophe of a decline and fall. We have marked the sudden divulging to the world of the long-kept secret of divine providence, the unveiling of the hidden continent, the progress of discovery, of conquest, of colonization, the planting of the church, the rush of immigration, the occupation of the continent with Christian institutions by a strange diversity of sects, the great providential preparations as for some divine intent still hidden behind the curtain that is about to rise on the new century. And here the story breaks off half told. To so many of his readers as shall have followed him to this last page of the volume, the author would speak a parting word. He does not deprecate the criticisms that will certainly be pronounced upon his work by those competent to judge both of the subject and of the style of it. He would rather acknowledge them in advance. No one of his critics can possibly have so keen a sense as the author himself of his incompetency, and of the inadequacy of his work to the greatness of the subject. To one reproach, however, he cannot acknowledge himself justly liable. He is not self-appointed to a task beyond his powers and attainments, but has undertaken it at the instance of eminent men to whose judgment he was bound to defer. But he cannot believe that even his shortcomings and failures will be wholly fruitless. If they shall provoke some really competent scholar to make a book worthy of so great and inspiring a theme, the present author will be well content. End of Chapter 22, Part 2. End of A History of American Christianity by Leonard Woolsey Bacon.